Genealogies of Memory conference. My name is Hanna Węgrzynek. I'm a historian and deputy director of the Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. The museum, which will be open in 4 years and will be located in historic building of the former hospital founded by Berson and Baumann families in 1878. You can see the building on the screen, and I would like to share with you a very good news. Since this Monday, the building belongs to the museum, and the necessary formalities have been completed on the 16th of November, on the 8th anniversary of the closure of the Warsaw Ghetto. And going to the session, so this session is titled Translation and Travel of Holocaust Memory Between Europe and Israel. Majority of speakers are connected with Israeli research institutions and museums, and most of the lectures will be given today have been devoted to shaping and transforming the memory of Holocaust in Israel, as well as to the role of the Holocaust experiences in the lives of various generations of Israelis. The session will be divided into 2 parts. The first one, the keynote section, and after a short break, about 15 minutes, we will have panel with presentations. And very important information concerning discussion. Those who follow the transmission on YouTube and or Facebook can address questions to the keynote speaker and presenters, and feel free to send your questions by email to the address which you can see on the screen. And those who follow us on Zoom can ask questions via a question and answers panel, and we will monitor these questions and introduce them to our speakers. And our keynote speaker is Professor Jackie FELDMAN. Jackie FELDMAN is an associate professor of anthropology at Ben-Gurion University of Negev and head of RAF Center for Holocaust Studies. His research interests are pilgrimage and tourism, anthropology of religion, Holocaust memory, ethnographic writing, and anthropology of museums. He has published 2 books, Above the Death Pits, devoted to the travels of Israeli teenagers to Poland, and the second one, A Jewish Guide in the Holy Land, How Christian Pilgrims Made Me Israeli. His current research project is Memorial Museum Smartphone, transmitting Holocaust memory in a digital generation. And the lecture he is going to give today will be, will be connected with this project. And the title of his keynote is The Vanishing Body of the Witness, Transmission of the Shoah in a Digital Generation. Professor FELDMAN, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Węgrzynek, and I want to thank the European Network for Remembrance and Solidarity for inviting me, and after listening to many of the talks so far, and I'm really honored to be here. At present, Holocaust memory is shaped by 2 major generational phenomena. the passing away of the last of the survivor eyewitnesses, and the rapid development of digital media. Looking at current media practices within a historical and social framework of Shoah transmission, I will argue that many contemporary digital technologies attempt not only to preserve the story of the witness, but to preserve his bodily presence as the witnesses are passing away. And while interactive holograms and augmented reality are some of the ways that this bodily presence of the witness is preserved in museums and memorials throughout the world, in Israel, practices such as selfies at death camps and memorials, and actors recounting first-person narratives of the Shoah provide alternatives to the missing body of the witness. What I argue is that secondly, that the specifically Israeli redemptive narrative of the Shoah facilitates the transition from the witness survivor to the witnessee, so that the center becomes not the witness, but the digitally enabled participatory recipient, as Amit Pinchevsky writes. The witness of the witness becomes the bearer of memory. So I'll begin with a brief sketch of the role of generations as carriers of particular memories of the Shoah, and argue for the importance of media technologies in determining the shape of memory. I'll then outline several challenges that digital and social memory pose for understandings of global collective memory of the Holocaust. And by focusing on place memory, memory at monuments and memorials, I'll describe there the dominant Israeli narrative of the Shoah and redemption, as well as the teleologies and the border work done on Israeli visits to Poland. So once I do this, so the first step to talk about the vanishing body of the witness, the role of technology, and then go back and speak about how the Israeli voyages to Poland, I then will show how digital media and selfies in particular affect the concentration camp visits, and then briefly survey several other examples of embodiment of the witness in contemporary Israeli Holocaust memory transmission. And to conclude, I will argue that the global technology of digital media is then inflected, it's translated through a particular local Israeli narrative in ways that make it easier to have a transition from the witness to the witnessee. In other words, the witness of the witness through selfies and other means as being now the representative or the replacement for the no longer present witness. Okay. So first, a bit about generations. Holocaust memory is shaped and reshaped in different ways in different locations. And for those who don't know it, I recommend very warmly the work of Chana Polin Galai, who showed how the same events are recounted by Lithuanian survivors differently, depending on whether they spent their post-war years in Lithuania, the United States, or Israel. So place and subsequent national memories can influence the way the Shoah is recounted and remembered, as well as the passage of time marked by generations. Now, when I speak about generation, third generation or fourth generation in the Israeli context, I'm not, at least in my talk, talking about transmission within the family. In Israel, when one speaks of third generation, one's primarily talking about the entire age cohort, the entire age group of the third generation, whether their grandparents had lived through the Shoah or not. And the way that the Shoah, the dominant mode of Shoah memory is influenced by the passage of time, but also by particular technologies. So, could we go on to the next slide? I'm having a little trouble with the interclicker. Fine. Here you see the photograph of the cemetery in which my grandmother was buried in Ungvar in today's Ukraine. And the survivor who pointed out who gave me the tour of the cemetery and who actually started me off on my research into Holocaust memory and commemoration. Okay. Next slide, please. Annette Viviorka speaks of three successive phases in the evolution of the roles and image of the Holocaust witness. The first phase was marked by the testimony left by those who did not survive the Holocaust but managed nevertheless to record their experience, such as the Oynik Shabbos archive of Emanuel Ringelblum. Also during that period, it was the documents, most often written by the Nazis, that were the authoritative evidence of the Shoah. The second phase began with the Eichmann trial, which for Annette Viviorka is the moment when the witness became the bearer of history, where his voice became audible. The author then follows the changing nature of the witness to a third phase, which she calls then the era of the witness. During that period, the witness itself becomes, and their oral testimony becomes at center. And other scholars such as Amit Pinchevsky and Jeffrey Chandler have argued that the centrality of the witness, the survivor, as the authoritative spokesman of the Shoah is related to technology and is related to particular media products. So that, next slide, please. Once the Yale archive, the Yale video archive was done in the late 70s and early 80s, all of a sudden we begin to have a large amount of accessible videos of witnesses, survivors speaking. And that as a result of the diffusion of the Yale video archive and later of media things like Schindler's List and still later of the USC Spielberg video project, what became the mark of the authenticity of the Holocaust testimony was no longer the seal on the document, but the physical presence of the witness. So very often what the witness could not say, because they choked up with tears, because they were unable to speak, this became the mark of authenticity. So that the development of a particular technology, like the video archive, influences what we consider to be authoritative memory. And then as a result of the Yale Video Archive, as a result of media products like Schindler's List, these become marks that will determine what memory is. So, for example, Chandler shows that even the survivors of Schindler's workshop would then provide testimony and affirm their testimony by pointing, like you saw in the film. And Pinchevsky points out how technology matters. So if technology makes a difference, if the fact that we can see the witness, we can watch them choke up, we can see their tears, becomes changes what we consider to be memory, then we need to ask, when we make the move from analog to digital media, when we now go to selfies and other things, what are the ways in which the witness will be made that memory will be made present, will be made authoritative, if this is the way, these are the tools, the media, the technologies we use for remembering. Next slide. Okay. So we have things like the Yale, the USC Dimensions in Testimony, where hologram-like images are broadcast after taking extensive questions and answers to the survivors, and then they're being activated in an interactive conversation based on keywords and phrases that are stored in the algorithm. We heard a bit about this at the last talk last night. Next slide. Or we have here a video testimonies of the here at Yad Vashem of the survivors speaking of their artifacts. Artifacts were frequently used in the museum as a way of making the survivors present when especially when the survivors could not be there. And today we see over the last 3 or 4 years that this is being augmented by survivors themselves coming in and telling the story of their artifact and being filmed in video and having that be able to be recovered. So that it's the bodily presence of the survivor through their video film that's being used to supplement the authority of the artifact as making the absent witness present. Next slide. Okay. And here we see an example of the augmented reality or so that's used in a conservative way by a museum in order to provide additional information on the photos that are in the museum exhibit. Here, I believe, in the United States Holocaust Museum. Next slide. Or we have in certain places mixed reality or virtual reality scenes or augmented reality that will enable people to visualize the Holocaust, to see the witness even if he's no longer there, and to imagine him as he was when alive. Next slide. Okay. So if we have these technologies that in part are focused on the body of the witness and how to keep the body of the witness present when the living witnesses are no longer there, I want to now turn to the questions of what challenges do the diffusion of digital and social memory present for Holocaust memory? Next slide, please. Okay. And the next slide. If I focus on place memory, and I say what difference does digital media and the easy access of digital and social media make, I identify here 3 processes. The first is that place memory is increasingly being formed by images. So when people go to a memorial or they go to death camps like Auschwitz, today they have a huge bank of images that's accompanying them on the way. Not only photos of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet troops, but also in particular photos of their friends and older siblings who were there and had their picture taken at the entrance to Auschwitz. On the way there, very often, they will see Schindler's List being played or other movies, and even on the bus before they get there, they're expecting the site to look like it did on the film, like it did in the image. So that being there is no longer an initial exposure to the shock of seeing, for example, the rails at Birkenau or the gas chambers at Majdanek, but rather people know what to expect, and when they see the place that matches the image, they know that they've been there. Okay. Second, the digital memory challenges hierarchies of authority at museums and at memorials. Okay, next slide. Okay. So we have here the selfie taking there at the museums. I'll come back to this in a little while. And next slide. Okay, where these memories, these selfies then are posted. In this case, it's not of Auschwitz, but of the memorial site to the murdered European Jewry in Berlin. And there, at visits to the site, people would play here, juggle or jump from stone to stone, or play hide and seek. And these images were then diffused on Facebook and even on dating sites like Flickr and Grindr. And the authority structure is such that they become very difficult to suppress once they're posted. So, for example, if someone is acting inappropriately at the site, for example, walking, doing balancing exercises on the rails at Birkenau, without these selfies, without the social media, it would be enough for a guard to say, get off the rails, and that was the end of it. But now, once the selfie is done, then the head of Auschwitz, right, or the Auschwitz Museum, Piotr Tsivinsky, can post something saying it's in what your behavior is inappropriate. But then, as during the chain, they can get talkbacks saying, "Why is it inappropriate? This is our way of witnessing," or "Why are you being so heavy? This is our This is our way of rendering honor of doing the visit." And even if the authority, in this case, that of the Auschwitz Museum, replies, with each reply, his authority is diminished because he becomes only talkback number 1, 6, 17, and 51. And other people can argue so that the authority is then of the caretakers over these sites are diminished. Once they're posted, they can travel pretty much anywhere. You see, there are attempts in order to stop this. For example, the Holocaust project done by Shahak Shapira, where what he did is to take the photos, next slide, please, of the jugglers. Next slide. Right, that's okay. And then to Photoshop them with not the memorial blocks in the back, but with photos taken at Auschwitz and at other camps in order to embarrass the people. And all those who he posted then had to apologize to him in order to have their posts taken down. However, the extent to which this can be done, next slide. Okay. You see, this is another way of trolling or blogging. You see that the person posted his slide here and said, well, getting a bit of culture before the stag post start, the stag party. And then someone else comes and trolls him and said, I hope you someday have to endure the same pain the people you just made fun of had to endure. So you can have this kind of censorship or a kind of talking back to disrespect online, but there really is no way of stopping the diffusion of these images. So that the authority here of the person posting, but also of those of memorial care, of museum caretakers, is diminished because people have access, students and others have access to so many images and so much information online, of which here the selfies and their travel is just one example. And thirdly, the mediation of the tradition, or the mediation of memory, becomes detached from face-to-face interactions and locales of daily life. So far what I've talked about is the idea that, well, people's notions of place are then created by the images they get online. Second, that the authority of the caretakers is diminished because of the way that the information, selfies and others, circulate online much faster than they can be suppressed. And then third is the question of social solidarity. When people come and they visit a place like Auschwitz, very often they're coming in a group, or sometimes they're coming with their family. And the act of going in and visiting the place is an act of commemoration. What happens when they go in and instead of the quiet, seeing the site, what they get is just masses of people standing with their backs to the site, having their selfie sticks up, taking their own pictures. While the person who's taking their picture on the selfie may be in communication with a community of their friends, they're also out of communication and ignoring the other people who are visiting the site who are not their friends. So the question is, what kinds of community are privileged? Is it the community of people who are now visiting the site together, or is it the community of people, of friends, who the person is posting to and waiting for the likes to come back for? These things conflict with each other at the site and create part of the problem. Okay. Next slide, please. After speaking now of some of the differences that these digital may make, and selfies in particular, I want to go back and talk about the Israeli redemptive narrative of the Shoah as it is illustrated through one of the most important, I think, representations of and commemorations of the Shoah in Israeli society, over the last 30 years, namely the Israeli youth trips to Poland, of which approximately 500,000, perhaps a bit more, students have gone together. Next slide. Okay. Here you see a photo again from the 90s of a witness standing atop the crematoria in Birkenau and at a ceremony. And there, at the end of the ceremony, after reciting the Kaddish, the morning prayer for his dead, he turns to the students and addresses them. Next slide. And says to them, how long will we Jews, your chosen children, be a victim and prey of the Gentiles? How long, how long? He then turns to the students, you know, you give me the strength to continue. I'm transmitting things that were sealed for 50 years, and I see that you thirst to know. And that's why we're here, so that you can be witnesses to what they did to our nation. Next slide. And then he concludes saying, you in this place know that you are the correct answer to Nazism and anti-Semitism. On one side are the crematoria in which hundreds of thousands were burnt, and now children, girls, and lads bring many sons to the nation so that we may live forever. So that what you see here is a redemptive narrative where the students are being witnesses of the witnesses, as well as a teleological answer to Nazism. The Nazis tried to destroy us. You, through your bodies, are the proof that we won, we defeated the Nazis. Next slide. Okay. These are from the film here, Uploading Holocaust, that are composed of sections of Israeli trips to Poland that were posted on public and social media. Next slide. Okay. And I want to show you here two sections of the visit in order to illustrate this notion of substitute the students, the young people, as substitute witnesses and answers. Okay, play the video, please. Okay. So here you see the group that is being accompanied by, in the 1990s, by a witness to Auschwitz, and she is describing, here's where the selection take place. We were here up to there in mud. It was terrible. And then she takes the group inside the barracks. Look, we went inside and now it stopped raining. Just translating for you, parts of it. So that's how it looked like. Do you see it? There was mud everywhere. We were cold, we froze, and so we would hug each other, right? Even women that we never met, we all hugged each other together. How many slept here together on one bed? Let's go listen. Ariel, how many people slept here together on each plank, each floor? Said, well, 10 of us. And when we wanted to turn around, one person wanted to turn, we all had to turn together to turn over. So you see he's counting out the 10 as if for a prayer quorum. And then he says, that's how they slept. Now, all of you turn over. I remember when we came in, I met a young Czech woman, and I said to her, look, I'm so tired. I don't have anyone. Do me a favor, give me something so that I can kill myself. I have no desire to live anymore. Why should I live? I have no one else anymore. And she answered, listen, I didn't give you life. I won't take life for you. We got used to it. You'll get used to it too. All right, take the picture. 1, 2, 3. Now it's 5 degrees out. And we want to feel what they felt in the ghetto when it was really cold. So we're going to get undressed, as many layers as we can, and sit for at least 1 minute and try to feel what they felt, okay?
טוב, די, תשבו, תנסו להרגיש. תעריכו את הבגדים שיש לכם בבית.
Would you stop? What is it, a show? What is it? Oh, that's for our school. Oh, I see. Cold. We're going to die. Now we understand, right, that what they felt. That's enough. Now let's get dressed. Next slide. Claude Lanzmann, in speaking of his film, wrote about the importance of embodiment. He said it's their own story they're telling, but it's not enough to tell it, they have to act it out. They have to be placed not only in a particular mental state, but in a particular physical state. Not in order to make them speak, but so that their words become suddenly transmissible and charged with another dimension. It is through the mise en scène that the witnesses become characters. And by extending it, I would say, it is through acting out, through feeling the cold, through placing themselves physically in the position of these survivors, that the students can feel that they were there and that they have become witnesses. Okay. Fade out now for a minute of the presentation. Okay. I want to just focus on. Okay, can we dim the presentation? All right. So there are. We can look at these selfies as a form of desecration of the dead. But other scholars have warned against the equation of Holocaust tourism with frivolity, and have argued that the selfie may be a way to inscribe oneself into a memory scape, because it makes the "I was there" doubly reliable as it's conveyed through both the body and through the sight. So that by looking into the camera, taking the selfie, one is making a reflexive image. And because they're uploaded to the web almost at the very moment that they're being taken, they're not a snapshot of the past, but a snapshot of the present that can affect and maybe change the past. It's a different way of narrating the self. And in a program we did with an exchange program with German students, the German students said that the selfies were a way of getting their friends who otherwise suffered from Holocaust fatigue interested in the events of the Shoah. So what I want to argue here is that two things. One is that in the selfie, the person who is taking the selfie at the site is positioning themselves as a substitute witness, as a witness of the witness. The witness, the survivor, is no longer there. Now the student taking the selfie is the witness himself. They're there at center. And second, that while we see this posting of selfies everywhere, that in Israeli society, it has a particular legitimation because of the practices of memory, the redemptive narrative of the Shoah that was presented on trips to Poland, but in Israeli society as the dominant narrative in general, which is that because we are Israeli, right? Can we go back a minute to the slide presentation? Okay, and one more slide. Next slide, and play that video.
תלמידים יקרים, מורים, מדריכים וכל השותפים למסע זה.
Here you see one of the ceremonies, in this case at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. We put up the flag, we wave the flag of Israel, and we say, never again, the people of Israel lives. We have come here in order to show the Nazis and those who follow them that we have won. The state of Israel is a fact. We are here also to say to the cruel Nazi Germans that you lost. You didn't succeed in extinguishing the spirit of man. You didn't succeed in extinguishing the spirit of the nation. Today, where terror is everywhere, anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews, new circles of hatred and racism, we cannot close our eyes. We still today, we must fight for our land against our enemies, and we'll soon go into the army, and you are the future of the people and the society of Israel. You are the next part, the next generation, and for you, you have the responsibility to remember so that the state of Israel and its security is maintained forever. Okay, next slide. Okay. So what I want to say is that while these selfies and putting oneself, the witnessee at center, are perhaps a worldwide phenomenon, in Israel they have a particular legitimation because of the narrative and how it places the body of the young student or the body of the witnessee, the witness of the witness. Right? That the youth are then seen as the future transmitters. The youth reenact the path of the witness, either through walking through where they are, or as you saw, through lying down, through being together, squeezed in a group of 10 in the area of the barracks. And therefore, the fact that the Israelis are present in their body at the site of Auschwitz is seen as a proof of Jewish continuity and as redemptive answer to the Shoah. So that the witnesses of the witness are not just playing at being witnessed by taking their photo and posting it. They are performing an act of witnessing that has already been sanctioned by or given approval by the Israeli narrative that's been going on for at least 30 years that said, you are the answer to their suffering. The fact that you are part of the state of Israel, the fact that you're healthy in body and spirit, the fact that you remain in Israel, that you fight for the state of Israel, this is a proof that they didn't win. The people of Israel, right, lives forever. You could have been there, and the fact that you are there, whether one is there or whether one is posting a selfie of being there, is seen not just a way of interesting others who are suffering from Holocaust fatigue or who are not interested, but are also a way of performing an act of witnessing. Next slide. Here you see, again, something that seems to be similar, which is the TikTok Holocaust Challenge, not Israeli, where young people painted or made themselves up with wounds and gave a first-person narrative of the Holocaust as if they're going to heaven. And it was very much attacked by curators of Holocaust sites and educators as a violation, one would say, of the sanctity of the Shoah. Next slide. Okay. You can see also that outside of Israel, there are bridging mechanisms that enable young people to see themselves as survivors. This one is the recording of an intergenerational visit to Auschwitz, where the grandfather here at center with his grandchildren and family will dance to the tune of Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive at Auschwitz and at other places where he was. And here too, the survival is then transmitted from the survivor grandfather to his grandchildren, but the linkage, the line of survival is through family lineage, through heritage. Whereas in Israel, that possibility of being the survivor is not restricted to the family, the descendants, but is one of being part of the national body. Next slide. Okay. So in addition to the selfies, where one testifies as a witness of the witness, we have instituted just this last year a new project called the Project of the Ambassadors of Memory. And in this, young people are trained to tell their story to classrooms and groups of young people in the first person. The person starting it was a second generation, a child of survivors. And some of the participants are third generation, so direct descendants, and they will be telling their grandparents' stories. But it's been broadened so that anyone is taught to tell the story. So one appears, say, before a group of school children and then says, when I was in Auschwitz, when I escaped from the ghetto, puts on certain clothes, and then is a kind of actor then that is transmitting the story until the next generation. And the fact that at least the founders of this project saw it a great success when some young kids said, ask the person, so tell me now, when did you come to Israel after you left the camps, even though the person was born in the 1960s, they see as a great success. Now, what I argue is that the Israeli redemptive narrative, where anyone who is part of Israel belongs to the nation, is or is potentially a witness of the witness, prepares the ground for projects like this, makes something like this more possible. Play gives a privilege to the embodiment of the witness by the witness of the witness as an answer to what do we do now that there are no longer any living survivors, any living witnesses around, right? And while this is done through acting, it's not done through media. The media, the taking of selfies and their sending then facilitates this even more to say, I was there, I'm the witness of the witness. Next slide. Now, I've made this a little bit easy in the sense that I've spoken of a redemptive narrative and given things that will support what I'm saying. And I think the continuation of the project is, what I'm planning on doing, is to look at the selfies of death camps and of memorials that travel, and to see what happens when we compare Israeli selfies to those of others. Do we see more Israeli selfies of people in groups, of people wearing flags, of people representing the body of the nation, as opposed to more playful selfies done by others? Now, it's a project that needs still to be done, and I'm not claiming that they're all uniform. Next slide. Here we see a project that was censored or kind of talked back to by Israeli educators called With My Pretty Ones in Auschwitz. So all kinds of pretty photos, almost like model-like photos in Israel that were talked back to, and eventually the site was taken down. Next one, next slide. And here we have a kind of a video clip that was put to music called selfie in Auschwitz is a violation, is dishonorable. And they make fun of the trips to Poland in ways that, and counter this sort of Israeli national narrative of you are the witnesses of the witnesses. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. But here we see a kind of both selfies and photos, a dominant mode, where the pictures are not of simply of the individual, but of the flag. The flag makes each individual part of a nation, And the nation that stands as a group then embodies the survival of the witness of the future generation, the revenge of the Jewish people against their enemies. To conclude then, I would say that while digital and social media may have a leveling effect, they travel all over, they may blur national or other boundaries, they may even create a kind of postmodern global memory of the Holocaust. An analysis of the selfies may demonstrate that the enclaval nature of Israeli Holocaust memory is extended through the social media representation, including selfies, so that the environmental bubble of the tourist or pilgrim visits to Auschwitz is then continued through the internet and social media rather than dissolved. Or, next slide, next slide please, or if we can speak of global and local memories, the global diffusion of memory through the World Wide Web, through the internet, that takes on a local inflection in Israeli culture because the Israeli redemptive narrative privileges the individual as part of the national body, and being of the nation of Israel makes one witness of the witness and a victory over, over the persecutors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Feldman. Thank you for your very interesting lecture, which can be a good starting point for still actual and very important discussion, how to teach about. And I think that we will explore the subject in the second part of the session. But now I would like to share with you some of my observations. In your lecture, you touch on issues that are important not only to psychologists, educators, and teachers, but also to people like myself, by which I mean historians and museums curators, who all too often trying to transmit as much information as possible. It is usually the main problem. Of course, we want to get our message across to young people, and we are asking ourselves how best to do this, how to make our educational and museum offer more appealing, how to attract a young audience. But we also have to ask ourselves what we must to do in order not to cross the subtle boundary between attractiveness and masquerade, so as not to trivialize our message by seeking to appeal to these groups. And we are also aware that multimedia presentations and games are today widely available, and they are not as they are not longer as attractive as they were 10 or 20 years ago, because anyone can have access to them at any time. From my experience, what is now becoming increasingly attractive when it comes to museums is not the virtual or the multimedias, but the real thing, as you stressed during your presentation, by which I mean the encounter with a real person, a witness or someone directly involved in the events, or an authentic artifact. It is also not just seeing something that is attractive, but also touching something real that can elicit a deep reflection or an emotional response. What is your opinion on this observation, and do you agree with my observation?
Thank you very much, Professor Wengi. I think that what we need to keep in mind is that artifacts and recordings, right, we give it a certain aura as being the real thing. The survivors are, with very few exceptions, are no longer there to speak to the groups. And when they are, they can only give a particular point of view, because those that are still alive are usually hidden child survivors, simply because the others have passed away or are no longer able in health-wise to transmit their story. So that video recordings, artifacts, are also representations. It's a certain kind of regime that tells us that the artifact is the real thing, in ways that the video recording, the hologram, even I would say sometimes the selfies, right, are not. Do museums have the should museums try to compete with the selfies and video games, or engage them? In part, I mean, this is an open question, and one that I think that I struggle with, and I think that museums, many should struggle with more, because the idea that we have the information, right? So museums feel they have a certain responsibility. Museums and memorials, they have a responsibility. They have a responsibility to transmit the facts transmit the history in a responsible way. They also imagine very often that by bringing contact with the witnesses, by giving the information, they'll succeed in things like creating a greater sense of moral responsibility for events in the present. And I think it is an assumption that has been that's been investigated far too little. Museums are very often invested in their ways of transmitting the past, in the authority that they have, like things over artifacts. And because they are so committed, they think that these things work. For many, it's, why should I care? So many of the groups that come into museums are captive audiences. They're brought there by their schools, and they don't have to come there, they're brought there. And the question is, how does one begin to engage them? And there's a tension between the engagement that comes through interactive games, through selfies, through social media, and the ways that museums are used to do things. I think there's no way of getting out of this interaction in order to get people interested and say, well, why does it matter? It's something that ended, 80 years ago. It ended long before I was, or 75 years ago. It ended long before I was born. And there needs to be really, for example, much better, I think, listening, not only to what museums want to do and to what teachers say, but the conversations that students have, listen in among themselves. What do they say to each other afterwards? One comes out and says, oh, check off the box, this changed my life. Did it? Maybe 5 minutes afterwards, yes. But in the long run, does it make the difference? And if by using selfies and interactive games, will that create a greater interest? I don't have the answer, but I think museums need to as some have done, to take this challenge more seriously. Otherwise, they may be guardians of information that young people don't really have access to anymore, that they don't really care about, because the ways are just not attractive enough, don't speak to them enough.
Thank you, Professor Feldman. Yes, I think that you see several very important issues: the problem of responsibility, museums, historians, educators, teachers, and other problem. You see our contemporary situation, rather actual situation, epidemic. You see, I never expect that that something like this can happen. So, and we, I thinking about epidemic of coronavirus. So, so also teach us that you see the history sometimes repeats, and the same situation can repeat. But I think that this is the subject for another discussion, and I got some questions to you. And the first one is question of Gabor Dani, who you know. Thank you for your amazing keynote speech. We observe now a critical turn in Holocaust memory, which is marked, as you stated, by vanishing body of witnesses. How do you see the question of authenticity in the context of a memory which is recreated or maintained by means of augmented reality and digital media? Is a memory cultivated by the means of augmented reality may be authentic? Can technology fill the space left empty by the vanishing body and the witness? And if yes, how authenticity of the past may be recreated? Or on the contrary, you see an inventable danger of undermining authenticity in the digital age. To put it simple, in general, how can you define authenticity in a digital era, in digital age? Okay. So
I think that you know, for me, coming out of very much of anthropology of tourism and pilgrimage, authenticity is, I almost never use the word without scare quotes around it. Authenticity is very much constructed. Authenticity is very much a question of authority. It is who authorizes and what does it mean for something to be authentic. That it is true to a particular historical period, that the authorities then proclaim that this is authentic. Yes, I think that the virtual reality, these witnesses of the witness, these things change what it means to remember, what it means to, and perhaps not what it means, these things change our notions of what is authentic. How much will that count for people in future generations? If we think of how much work needs to be done, both through reconstruction and through narrative, in order for something to be authentic, it should make us reflect and not take this on the surface. Yesterday, the keynote spoke about the agency of bacteria and how much reconstruction, for example, and maintenance work needs to be done at, quote, the authentic places of memory, like in the death camps, in order for them to look something like, look in ways that will allow people, visitors, to imagine that they were actually barracks, crematoria, gas chambers, watchtowers there. All this requires an incredible amount of work in order for them to be seen as, quote, right, authentic. Now, the digital, you know, threatens or does, it places kind of these representations, these traveling images alongside the physical sites. What differences will it make? Will it mean that there's no longer a way of dividing between or differentiating between historical truth and people's images or their imaginations of it? Will it mean, for example, if I think of authenticity, one of the things that creates authenticity is the sense of community, emotion and shared emotion and community that can be affected through a particular object or particular place, particular ritual. Can this sense of community that gives a kind of consensus that makes people say, ah, this is authentic because here's where I felt that it happened. Can that be done through digital means? The whole notion, right? The visits to the camps are an act of commemoration, as even more than they are an act of learning, right? An act of or facts. It's to feel. It's to stand there together, to commemorate together, to raise a flag, to sing a song, to walk in together in a particular posture. What happens, for example, when commemorations go from physical co-presence to being online? This is something that we've all had to deal with this past year when all the Holocaust commemorations went online. Can they have the same effect? But the emotion or the affect that results from commemoration, from physical being at a site, is part of its authenticity. Let me give another example very briefly. I've done a lot of work with evangelical pilgrims coming to the Holy Land. Evangelical pilgrims hate the traditional place where archaeological place where of Jesus' crucifixion in the Holy Sepulchre. They have another site that's there at the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is a 19th century site, was invented in the 19th century, and has no remains there from Jesus' day. You talk to people, pilgrims who have come there, and they will tell you, well, you know, it could have been there, and it could have been here, it could have been there. Maybe archaeological evidence points to the other site, but here's where I felt the Spirit of God touch me. How does one argue with that? That, well, you know, you're wrong, and archaeology says it's in the Holy Sepulchre, even if it doesn't look right to you? Is the Garden Tomb, this new site, inauthentic because it doesn't have archaeological evidence? I think that the digital age makes us reflect more deeply on exactly what do we mean when we talk about authenticity. And that's, of course, not simply restricted to Holocaust memory.
Thank you very much. I think that emotions, as you said, are the most authentic, you see, and this is also a very, very important role of museums, you see, to create these emotions, because usually we don't have authentic objects. We have to make copies because conservatory limitations, but on a way to create emotions, so we can try to do that. And another question, this is a question.
Can I just a brief, one very brief comment?
Yeah.
I think that we should really examine at least among the younger generation, how important are these authentic objects for them? We assume that, you know, there's a kind of aura that attaches to the authentic object and that will create a kind of emotion that its replica won't. Maybe, but I'm not sure. And as digital media expands, maybe even less.
Yeah, yeah. No, you see, I have such observation, but anyway, I'm not able to present any, you see, statistical data, and so. But anyway, talking about that, I would like to ask you another question. You traveled to Auschwitz, to Poland, many, many times. So Do you see, and I think that you do, differences between the group of teenagers which visit Poland? You see, visited Poland 20 years ago, and they come here today. And what kind of difference are you able to precise? If there is really a big change in reactions of young people?
I should say, first of all, I need to say that, you know, most of my research on trips to Poland, right, was done over 20 years ago. And while I've kept up, I'm not following, right, these groups. I'm following them by reading, by talking to people, but not by, you know, actually observing groups that have come today. Nevertheless, I would say that I'm surprised at how much the things that many of the students say and are report and say how little they've changed in many ways from what I observed intensely about 20 or 25 years ago. I have a book to recommend. It was just translated in English. It's a novel. And it's written as a guide accompanying trips to Poland, who sends a report to the head of Yad Vashem, or at least what is now the former head of Yad Vashem, but that's another story. They're now the government attempting to promote someone who I can only call a racist fascist as the new head of Yad Vashem. But the book is called The Memory Monster. And what he does is he shows how this trips, I have the book here in Hebrew, by Yishai Sarid. I very strongly recommend it. It's a gripping book.
Okay.
And he kind of, although it's fiction, it is a very accurate portrait of what's happening. I would say there are several changes that have happened. I think the biggest change is digital media and the accessibility of the cell phones. So that while it's always difficult to keep the attention of students where there are not I would say the strong dark tourism, there's a kind of a thrill that many of them get on going into the gas chambers and seeing bones and hair and so on. But when they come into historical sites, it's very difficult to maintain their attention, and has gotten much more difficult over the years. One could go to Warsaw in the 1990s and walk around the area near in the district, right near the Polin Museum of today, and imagine, even if the buildings were built in the 1950s, that this might have been how it looked like during the time of the ghetto, and see some remains. Today, it becomes much, much more difficult as Warsaw and places all over Poland has modernized, and it becomes more difficult for the students to visualize the past when looking at the present. The second thing that's happened is that, so the landscape has been modernized and that's changed. There are so many images that students are not surprised anymore, and they expect the place to look exactly like their image, and they can carry those images with them wherever they go because the cell phones and the web is so accessible, and they can take pictures and send them out, so that it becomes more and more difficult for them to be completely in the site, because they're always thinking of, well, how am I going to look? And have I got the selfie? And have I sent it out right? And am I going to get the likes right here? And so they're never totally in the site. They're always thinking of how it's going to look when my friends in Twitter or Facebook or whatever get it and respond to me. The third, so that's changed, and there are more and more distractions. And in the book, the author mentions that he tries to tell his story over the microphone and be heard overing what he calls the flickering lights of the telephones, because everyone is in their telephone and talking in a conversation with someone else, or looking for new songs or new things. So it becomes harder to maintain concentration, which I think every teacher has discovered, among his own students, not only on trips to Poland. The other thing that's happened is that security has become even more tight than it was. While these trips to Poland were always kind of protected in a bubble by Israeli security, which painted Poland as a tremendously dangerous place, now this is for ideological reasons. Now this has become even more so because security controls everything. And there's practically no free time and practically no room for improvisation. It's become more bureaucratized, more securitized, and there's just much less room to say, okay, forget about this site, let's go somewhere else, because that's more important for what we want to accomplish, because security won't let it happen. And perhaps the final thing is that the neoliberal thinking has infiltrated down to the level of parents and students. So, like on many guided tours, how many places are we seeing? How much are we getting for our money? So it becomes difficult to say, let's only go to one place today because we need 4 hours to sit and discuss and challenge their, no, we need to get it done. Otherwise, what? We only saw one place, but the other group saw three. We're not getting our money's worth, right? So these things have changed the trips. They've also been branches of the trips. So now there are trips for army soldiers, there are trips for people with mental handicaps. There are even motivation trips for corporations that instead of sending their people on vacation, will send them to go together to Poland as if that's what will unite them and make them witnesses and pledge their loyalty to a company. So this has become, I think, a massive industry in which the memory is very often harnessed not only for national needs but also interacts with new media, with neoliberal economy, with a greater securitization of Israel, and so on. I should say it is possible to go to Poland, to go to the trips, to go to the camps, excuse me, and to affirm a humanistic message rather than a nationalistic one. But it's very difficult to do that given the way that these trips are constructed and continue to be constructed. You need to break out of the bubble of us and them in order to ask the questions that I think the universal questions that are important. And if you have to bring everyone to Poland and make sure that they stay secure in the bubble and get their money's worth, it's very, very hard to do that.
Thank you very much. You see, I think that I have the same observation concerning Polish teenagers, so there is not a big difference, and thank you for your recommendation. And I have one more question. We have only 3 minutes, and I'm afraid that will be difficult to answer on it in such a short time, but anyway, if you can try. This is a question from Małgorzata Pakier. Thank you for the most inspiring lecture. You were speaking about changing communities of memory through the increasing use of digital media. Would you like to reflect on difference between democratization and anarchization of memory in this regard?
I think I need more time. Not
yes,
only
I think
say,
so, but
more time to think about it than in 3 minutes.
I'm sure that we will have opportunity to continue this discussion. Yeah.
I'm not sure solidarities in an age that's been more and more marked by a non-hierarchical wild spread of information and images right everywhere. But that certainly is, a problem not specific to Holocaust memory. Look at Trump's election defeat and the diffusion of information, the way information is being diffused there, only as one example. So, there are hierarchies within the diffusion of digital information. Often they're harder to figure out because the big companies like Facebook or so, or won't don't release the way that their algorithms work. But we have access to more and more information than ever before, and yet every time we open our computer or cell phone, we're flooded with information that is specifically catered to the way that to our choices and the information that we've requested before. So they close us within particular bubbles where the companies want us to simply to spend more time online and to hear the information that they think that we want to hear, right? And this is way beyond Holocaust memory. And how does one create a common memory or a common memory if the aim is that creates a greater ethical sensitivity in a digital age? I don't know. And I think it's one question that students or scholars of digitalization need to deal with, and thus I welcome the study of this intersection of digitalization and Holocaust memory, because if the Holocaust memory had become a kind of, as Levy and Schneider said, a sort of a touchstone for other conflicts and for other genocides, which we should investigate critically and not simply take as, that's true. What happens when ways of creating a consensus, ways of diffusing memory become so widespread? I'm thinking of, for example, the so-called Warsaw death camp that was posted on Wikipedia in several languages and took several years to take down, right? And became fact for so many people. That's only one example. The questions are very big, and I think should concern not only media scholars but also educators and historians as well.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, but we have to stop our discussion due to the schedule. Thank you again for your lecture. Thank you again for the discussion. We have 15 minutes break, and we will meet again in 15 minutes. It is nice to see you again, and we can open the second part of the sixth session of the conference Genealogies of Memory. We have 5 speakers and 1 video presentation. And our first speaker will be SHARON ZELNICK, who is PhD student in the Department of Comparative Literature at University of California, Los Angeles. She is interested in contemporary literature, cultural memory, photography, embedded literature, migration and exile, Holocaust studies and trauma. Her research focuses on post-memory in literary and artistic works across Palestinian, Israeli, German context. And the title of her presentation is Migratory Reimaginations, Postmemorial Work of Israeli Migrants to Germany. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So I'll just go ahead and get started. At a 2015 panel on Jewish identities in Berlin, the Israeli-born, Berlin-based German studies scholar Yael Almog posed the following questions to a group of fellow Israelis. Is our presence here a critique of Israel? Is our diasporic community a manifestation of something worse? What happens when you cross paths with an Israeli organized protest against Israeli policies? Almog refers to this moment in her moving short memoir, Illusory Diasporas. Almog is one of approximately 25,000 Israelis who migrated to Berlin over the last 20 years. This bourgeois community includes scholars, artists, and authors. The emerging body of work created by these Israelis in Germany dealing with the Holocaust and often also the occupation of Palestine calls attention to the particular memory dynamics of third-generation descendants who moved there. I will refer to these Israelis who moved to the place from which their grandparents emigrated as reverse migrants. The word reverse is used to indicate the flip direction these Israelis choose to take compared to the move their grandparents were forced to make. The layers and significances of the reversal have moral components. Reflecting on the aftermath of the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt's comments in The Origins of Totalitarianism help historically contextualize the multifaceted layers of reversal that take place with this particular migration. Arendt explains, and I quote, "After the war, it turned out that the Jewish question, which was considered the only insolvable one, was indeed solved, namely by means of a colonized and then conquered territory. But this solved neither the problem of the minorities nor the stateless. On the contrary, like virtually all other events of our century, the solution of the Jewish question merely produced a new category of refugees, the Arabs, thereby increasing the number of stateless and rightless by another 700,000 to 800,000 people." Arendt calls attention to how the wave of European Jewish emigration to Palestine switched who suffered. Decades later, the current Israeli occupation of Palestine can be seen as causing another reversal, the occupation, as Almond proposes in her aforementioned memoir, inspires many Israelis to come to Germany, and in doing so, escape being perpetrators. According to Ariella Aisha Azulai, Israelis have the right not to be governed by the regime, to go on strike together with those whose rights were disabled. The act of going on strike with Palestinians is a form of what Azulai explains is co-citizenship, a set of moral assumptions and practices shared by scholars, artists, and authors who, and I quote from her, oppose imperialism, colonialism, racial capitalism, and its institution of citizenship as a set of rights against and at the expense of others, end quote. While their physical move alone is not an act of co-citizenship, the reverse migrants' aesthetic works, when they highlight Israel's injustice towards Palestine, are. As a result of this phenomena, a series of questions related to memory, migration, and responsibility arise. Namely, what memory dynamics emerge when Israeli third-generation Holocaust descendants migrate to the place from which their grandparents suffered and subsequently fled? How does being in Germany encourage Israelis to renegotiate their relationship to Israel and Palestine? How does the postmemorial aesthetic work of reverse migrants shift depending on the medium and language in which they are working, as well as their familial or affiliative positionality? And with familial and affiliative, I'm referring to Marianne Hirsch's use of the term. So taking Israeli-born, Berlin-based filmmaker Danny Gall's White City as my case study, I will begin to broach this topic. I analyze how Gall's thematic and aesthetic choices reveal disruptions and coalescences between Palestinian, Israeli, and German histories of violence, as well as shed light on the particular memory dynamics of these reverse migrants. White City is the final film in Gall's historically based fictional trilogy dealing with interconnections between the Holocaust and the Nakba. White City's plot is framed around a 1933 entry from Arthur Rupin's diary. Rupin was a leader of Zionism. Rupin's diary entry details his discussion with Professor Hans F.K. Günther, a race researcher and eugenist who influenced National Socialist racial thought. The film stages this meeting, Rupin conducting race research, his journey through different parts of Germany, and flashbacks of his recent trips to Palestine. In the moments of his flashbacks, the camera typically focuses on Rupin's surroundings, and then follows him from behind, with voiceovers of his reflections. The film begins and ends with the same image of Stuttgart. Gall, which I believe you'll be able to see very shortly. Gall starts his film, here we go. So the film ends and begins with the first image that we see here. The film begins and ends with the same image of Stuttgart that we see, as I said. And Gall starts his film by focusing on photographs, and he ends it by filming Rupin, played by Alexander Fanon, walking in Stuttgart. Through his reconstruction of Rupin's diary, Gall creatively intervenes in the way Holocaust and the Nakba are misremembered. White City is an artistic act of co-citizenship that highlights, through its hybrid form of photographs and film, as well as dual focus on the past and the present, the complex ways these catastrophes are interconnected on transnational and transgenerational levels. White City immediately confronts viewers with the complex ways that memories can be shaped, shifted, and manipulated. The two monochrome images that the camera focuses on, that we see here, are actually the same photograph, the latter of which is a doctored version. The image was doctored by the Nazis to make viewers believe that this was an Arab town rather than a German one. Therefore, although the architecture looks like Palestine from the early 20th century, the photograph was taken in Stuttgart, Germany in 1932. Gall zooms in on the first image of a camel as well as Palestinians walking on the street for 15 seconds, or people dressed as Palestinians. Then the hand flips this image and we see one of the same place, but stripped of all the people. The second image is in focus for a mere 4 seconds. the fact that the camera dwells on the first image for 3 times as long as it does the second image importantly gestures at the longer amount of time that the Palestinians were there and how people often pay more attention to doctored narratives rather than uncovering hidden truths. Gal's attention to sound during this opening scene reinforces the violence that is implied in the movement between the 2 images. When the camera focuses on the first image, we hear birds chirping softly in the background, painting a picture of life during this time as being peaceful and harmonious. Then we hear a loud swoosh noise when the man's hand flips over the photograph, and afterwards birds chirp again. The shift in sound eerily suggests that there was a type of pastoral existence before and after the removal of Palestinians. The swoosh has a cacophonic effect that aesthetically suits the violent nature of a population removal and the speed at which it was covered up. The sounds and visuals together call on us as viewers to remember not only the violent moments of catastrophe for the Palestinians, but also the ways in which they have been systematically removed from official state narratives. Gal shows the visible invisibility of Palestinians and their history, and I'm pulling that term from Gil Hochberg's Visual Occupations. As Erlich Baer explains, photographs can make us, and I quote, as viewers for the first time, responsible for a past moment that has been blasted out of time, end quote. Gal's rhetorical use of these images is meant to encourage his viewers to be responsible on 2 levels. Firstly, to actively remember the uprooting that the Palestinians experienced, and secondly, to recognize the moments of the blasting themselves by paying attention to the way he is reversing this invisibility. Jean Ma and Roland Barthes provide useful means for further unpacking the significance of the photographs in White City. Gal's photographs work in a similar way to Roland Barthes' idea of photographs as counter-memories. Barthes explains in Camera Lucida that photographs often block memory and create new contradictory memories. And he writes in Camera Lucida that not only is the photograph never in essence a memory, but it actually blocks memory, quickly becomes a counter-memory, end quote. Photographs can obstruct actual memories of events and instead become representations of alternative memories. In addition to the fact that these are doctored images, the second photograph in White City, the one that we see below, particularly echoes Barthes' claim. By including a photograph of Stuttgart that looks like Palestine as being empty, rather than one that shows Palestinians being expelled, Gal demonstrates the construction of counter-memories. Since images like these remain central to Israel's construction of its cultural memory, they function as counter-memories. Because of its lack of traces of the Palestinians, the second photograph in particular poignantly exemplifies how the medium is capable of constructing manipulative counter-memories. Gal exemplifies how photographs in films uniquely compel viewers to reflect upon the various modes through which history is mediated and sometimes manipulated. By using photographs which initially seem out of place for a film, Gal's aesthetic matches the intrusion that the content of the image calls up. In doing so, our attention is drawn to the way seminal moments in the history of Germany, Israel, and Palestine have been manipulated by media sources. In light of this, Gal's intervention, though he focuses on the Nazis, may be, by extension, understood as a reversal of the counter-memory that has been put forward by the Israeli state. In addition to using 2 mediums to attempt to reverse the multifaceted manipulations of Holocaust and Nakba memories, Gal's dual focus on Rubin's memories of Palestine and his current experiences in Germany positions us to consider the past, present, and future of Israel, Palestine, and Germany. The movement between Rubin's memories of walking through Haifa and Tel Aviv and current experiences of visiting Gunther and performing his race research highlights the centrality of movement and of Germany as a place for both Rubin and Gal's reconsiderations of Palestine. Rubin's movements back and forth result in his bringing injustice into being through colonial practices. Contrastingly, Gall's migration to Germany inspires greater attention to the injustice in Palestine. The contemporary Holocaust memory focus of Germany can be seen as inspiring Gall's increased need to undo the pervasive erasure of Nakba memories among both Israeli and German audiences. Being surrounded by Germany's contemporary focus on its perpetrator past and current conversations about how our overfocus on Holocaust memory can be debilitating inspires his artistic act of co-citizenship. Gall is both trying to hold Israel responsible for its current perpetration and past actions of removing things from the dominant discourse, and also remind Germans of their complex implication in the Nakba. Thus, through his filmmaking, Gall can be seen as transnationally piecing together post-memories of the Holocaust and the Nakba. The coalescence of European, Palestinian, and Israeli memories and realities of injustice is heightened towards the end of the film as Rupin walks through what looks like Palestine, while the soundtrack offers a mix of European sounds and Arab electronic music. By juxtaposing the two types of sounds, the European classical piano and the Arab electronic music, Gall draws our attention to the way the Zionist European culture coexisted and clashed with Palestinian Arab culture. This sense of clash is heightened by the visuals. Rupin is dressed in a suit and the Palestinians are in rugged attire, similar to what we see in the above photograph. As Rupin is walking, we see the live scenes captured in the photographs with which White City begins, these images. However, rather than moving straight from the image of the people to one of the empty space, as is the case with the filmed photographs in the opening scene, we now see the Palestinians loading themselves as well as their belongings into a truck that a man in uniform drives up to the street. This scene recalls Jews being hoarded up into trains in Germany, and in doing so, Gall connects the injustices that occurred in Europe and the Middle East. Approaching this scene through the lens of what Michael Rothberg has termed multidirectional memory illuminates how through his audiovisuals, Gall expresses moral claims. According to Rothberg, recognizing the movement of memories as intercultural and productive allows us to see how multiple histories of injustice can be looked at together in ways that form solidarity rather than competition. In the aforementioned scene, Gall is gesturing at the fact that this car is headed towards Palestine, which functions similarly to concentration camps. In reminding us of both histories, the film's ending exemplifies Rothberg's claim that when one, and I'm quoting from multidirectional memory, gives up exclusive claims to ultimate victimization and ownership over suffering, other people's histories and memories can serve as a source of renewal, end quote. By being in Berlin, Gall and others like him turn their attention to the ways in which the crisis in Palestine is connected to, rather than in competition with, memories of the Holocaust. Furthermore, by having the Palestinians go into the car as opposed to a train, Gall shows that these were not exactly the same situation, which echoes Rothberg's emphasis on forming solidarity through a logic of similarity rather than equation. Gall's music choices, inclusion of doctored images, and reconstruction of Rupin's conversations function by recycling memories in the productive sense of which memory scholar Anne Rigney speaks. Rigney posits that cultural memory work evolves through the recycling and adaptation of old forms in new situations. The recycled diary entry that White City reconstructs exemplifies the film's productive and multidirectional nature, which brings these histories of interconnected injustice into focus. It is from the position of distance from his homeland, in a place that calls up post-memories of the Holocaust, that Gall criticizes both Israel's present practices and its past removal of certain images from cultural memory. White City functions as an artistic act of co-citizenship by investigating and reconstructing the transnational, transhistorical, and intertwined injustices of the Holocaust and the Nakba. Gal's film both responds to some of the questions with which I open my paper and raises a series of others related to Berlin being a catalyst for Israelis' intergenerational memory work. And this is a project that I'll continue to think about and look at many other case studies in addition to Gal's. So please, I welcome many critical comments and feedback and questions in our discussion portion. So finally, the film instills a sense of hope that there will be increased engagements like it among his cohort of reverse migrants, and that we will be inspired to look critically at our own shifting post-memories and how they affect us depending on our positionality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon, very much. I would like to remind that we are collecting questions.
I think I'm still live, but that's it for now. I really look forward to discussing this in the Q&A portion.
So the discussion will be at the end of the session, but anyway, we are still collecting questions, so please send them. And now I would like to introduce our second panelist, is WERONIKA ROMANIK. WERONIKA holds her PhD in literature from Hebrew Studies at the Faculty of Oriental Studies, at the Warsaw University. She has also opportunity to study at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, New York, Lund, Tel Aviv, and Vilnius universities. She was lecturer at the University of Wrocław and at the University of Warsaw. And currently, she is a postdoc Moritz Stern Fellow in Modern Jewish Studies at Lichtenberg College, the Göttingen Institute for Advanced Studies. Her research interest includes Hebrew studies, cultural memory studies, Yiddish language and culture, Holocaust studies, oral history, and social archives. And as I remember, WERONIKA for a long time is working our Tenenbaum archive, so Bialystok Ghetto archive, and also her lecture, which she is giving today, will be devoted to this subject. And the title of the lecture is Transformation of Memory in Microperspective, the Hebrew editions of writings from the underground archive of the Bialystok Ghetto. WERONIKA, unfortunately, your time is limited to 15 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much for the invitation to the conference. Can you hear me well?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
This paper is based on my PhD project. I finished it last year, but I still continue exploring other aspects. In this research, I focus on the legacy of Mordechai Tenenbaum Tamarov, a member of Dror Chechalut's Zionist youth movement, as he initiated the underground archive of Bialystok Ghetto. I call him the Ringelblum of Bialystok Ghetto. One may also call him the Anielewicz of Bialystok Ghetto, as he indeed became the leader of the resistance movement and of the revolt in the ghetto in August 1943. The primary sources of my project are 5 manuscripts written by Tenenbaum in the first half of 1943, preserved in the underground archive. These are multilingual sources written mostly in Hebrew with some parts in Yiddish, Polish, single words in German and Russian, and even one expression in English. They include a variety of detailed information about the Jewish resistance movement, the contacts of the underground and the Jewish Council, and runs up in Bezirk Bialystok. They were published twice, only twice in Hebrew editions, both titled Dapim min Hadleka, Pages from the Fire. The first edition in 1947, annotated by Itzhak Zuckerman and with his introduction, published yet in Palestine, and the second edition in 1984, edited by Tzvi Schner and Bronka Klibański. The editors of the Dapim min Hadleka were distinguished experts on Holocaust history. Tzvi Schner was involved in numerous scholarly publications on the Holocaust, and together with Zuckerman, they were co-founders of the Ghetto Fighters House. Zuckerman and Klibański were themselves Holocaust survivors, and what is more, they knew Tenenbaum personally. The personal involvement of the editors is especially interesting aspect of this project. In the research, I treat the narration as a memory medium, and I make a distinction between three basic narrations, Mordechai Tenenbaum, the first edition and the second edition. The key questions that I pose are, what are the ways the narration may have changed during the process of translation, editing, and archiving? How are memories transferred and transformed in these specific sources? I define the narration as both textual content and physical medium. In the research, I combine cultural memory concept with redaction criticism. This fusion allows me to examine the role of editors and translators, or the editorial team, as memory shapers and actors of memory. They participate in the process of transmission of narrations of the past, and they contribute to this process in a significant way. The examples of the influence of the editorial team on the published text, the changes of narrations, I call transformations of memory or micro changes of memory. Here is the list of the micro changes of memory. They include changes in syntax and different grammar forms, even punctuation marks. But of course, there are many other categories involved here. We can see the contribution of editorial team in the design of the page, and of course, deleted excerpts and so on. Each of these elements can influence the message of the author and the reception of the information by readership. So they participate in the long-term communication process across generations. Let us have a look at some examples. The first one is about structure and titles. The introduction to the first edition, written by Itzhak Zuckerman, entitled Mordechai Tenenbaum, was renamed in the second edition to Mordechai Haveri. It means Mordechai, my friend, or Mordechai, my fellow. Thus, the editors wished to conclude the volume by emphasizing not only the close relationships of Zuckerman with Tenenbaum in the past, but also Zuckerman's guardianship of the legacy of the ghetto fighters. Moreover, it may serve as the example of the cultivation of the myth of camaraderie between the fighters of the Jewish resistance. I would like to thank Professor Rachel Brenner for her contribution to this interpretation. The second example, both editions present two different versions of Hebrew translation of one of the manuscripts that is written entirely in Polish. The second edition presents definitely more formal, higher register, more formal language style. For example, the word śniadanie, simply in Polish breakfast, was translated in the first edition as aruchat boker. That is commonly used word for breakfast also in the modern standard Hebrew. In the second edition, it was translated as pat shacharit, which is a literary term meaning morning's meal, morning's bread. This is one of the numerous examples in the text. It is a way of a higher register. It is a way to show a great respect but at the same time reflecting the tendency to mythologize a figure of Tenenbaum as the hero of the ghetto. The translation from the first edition is definitely closer to the vernacular style of Tenenbaum's text. The first example is about personal involvement. Bronka Winicka-Klibański is a unique figure in this case study. During the war, she served as liaison on the so-called Aryan site in Bialystok and was involved in the process of hiding the secret archive outside the ghetto. What is more, during the war, she fell in love with Tenenbaum. After the war, she worked for many years in the Yad Vashem archives. There is a meaningful contribution from Bronka Klibański to the second edition, as only she could add some specific detailed information about the events she witnessed in Bialystok. I argue that micro traces of her individual memory are visible in the footnotes and arrangement of the documents in the book, for example, in the text-picture relation. It can be stated that her biographical memory was in dialogue with the archival documents and ultimately was transformed into a cultural memory. The changes in narrations are in some cases intentional, in others non-intentional. And here I see a reference to passive and active forgetting, two categories introduced by Aleida Assmann, and I see a potential of using these categories in further research. I bring them from the macro level of analyzing the dynamics of cultural memory to the micro level of text analysis. I reformulate this model, focusing mainly on intentional as active forgetting and non-intentional acts as passive forgetting done by editors. Moreover, according to my research results, censorship as the active forgetting may be reconstructed even if material destruction was almost total, because it was possible to reconstruct it completely erased word owing to the context and allusion existing in some other mediums. Doing this research, I have taken on an approach I call cultural micro-memory, which moves our focus to transformations of memory in different versions of an original source and its narrative. This approach draws on work done in biblical studies and many other fields, but in integrating ideas from memory studies, stresses the role of actors of memory in this narrative transformation process. This approach may be applied not only in the case of critical editions, but also other mediums of memory and variety of narrations. Moreover, it enables transdisciplinary perspective and searching for some common patterns, categories, or unique phenomena. This approach can contribute to study on change. Thank you very much. I see that I have still some time, but I'm happy I managed to do it on time.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I would love to talk more.
Yes, I think that during discussion we will have opportunity to give more examples. You will have opportunity to give more examples, differences between various editions of Tenenbaum archive. And now I would like to introduce our third speaker, Professor LIAT STEIR-LIVNY, who is assistant professor at the Department of Cultural Studies, Creation and Production at Sapir College, and tutor and courses coordinator for the Cultural Studies MA program and the Department of Literature, Language and Art at the Open University of Israel. Her research focuses on the changing commemoration of the Holocaust in Israel from the 1940s until now. She is an author of numerous articles and 5 books in 2019, she won the Young Scholar Award granted by the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. And the title of her presentation is Eva Stories, a new dimension of Holocaust memory on Instagram between the universal and the local. You're welcome.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the introduction. And following Professor Feldman's talk, I would like to address one case study within the digital age. And this is Eva's story. You can see here a highly controversial and very successful Instagram project. Eva Heyman was a 13-year-old girl from Hungary who was murdered in Auschwitz. And years later, entrepreneur Mati Kohavi and his daughter Maya adapted her diary into dozens of Instagram stories that were uploaded to Instagram on Holocaust Memorial Day. Now, this combination of the Holocaust with Instagram, which is especially for youngsters and is connected with the mundane and even silliness, created a great controversy in Israel during the 2 weeks before Holocaust Memorial Day. But when the stories went viral, the wind had changed completely, and it was crowned one of the most innovative projects in the digital age. Now, I would like to treat this project or to address it within the wider context of more than 70 years of Holocaust commemoration in Israel and ask whether this project indeed cheapens the Holocaust as claimed all the people in the 2 weeks before it was uploaded, or is it indeed a new innovative approach in Holocaust memory? Spoiler, I believe that neither, and I will show it later on. But first, let's begin with Eva and her diary. So, as I said earlier, Eva Heyman was a 13-year-old girl in a bourgeois family in Hungary. She lived with her grandparents after her parents got divorced, and she began writing her diary in February 1944, so she managed to discuss the normal life before the Nazis entered Budapest. And then she described in her diary the very quick deterioration. They were forced, the Jewish schools were closed, they were forced to wear the yellow badge, and then they were deported to Ghetto in Budapest, and from there to Auschwitz. She was deported to Auschwitz on May 1944 and succeeded to survive until October, when she was taken into the gas chambers. Her entire family perished, but her mother survived. Her mother returned to Budapest, and she published her diary in 1948 in Hungarian, and then it was published in Hebrew, as you can see here, in 1964. This is the entrepreneur Mati Kohavi and his daughter Maya. He is a well-known millionaire in Israel. He has various new media companies, and she works in social media. And they were interested in what they called it, making the Holocaust accessible. This is the term they used, making the Holocaust accessible for youngsters. In their opinions, museums do not work anymore. And if we want to make the Holocaust accessible for youngsters, we have to enter their world. So they've decided to take a diary of a youngster from the Holocaust, a youngster that can talk to youngsters our age, and adapt it to dozens of Instagram stories. Now, those of you who are not familiar with this app, Instagram stories are 15 seconds videos in which many people, many youngsters upload various scenes from their daily life, their routine. They often accompany it with emojis and captions and so on. So what they've done is a high-end 2-week production in Lvov. There was a production company that managed the historical reconstruction. Basically, what they did is they filmed a short film about a girl, about Eva, her regular life before the Holocaust and the Nazis enter, the deportation to the ghetto, and so on. And they have later divided it into dozens of Instagram stories. What they did is they took, each scene was filmed with two devices. First, a smartphone, to make it as if she uploads things to her Instagram. And the second was a camera with a special lever that the actress held in her hand to simulate a camera. Mati Kochavi invested his own money in the project and also directed it himself. It was his first directing gig. Now, the promotional campaign began 2 weeks before Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel, which was May 1st, 2019. First, it began in the newsletters, print, and media. Then, prominent celebrities were asked to upload this project to their social media, and they have agreed. And later, these posters were posted all over the Ayalon highways in Tel Aviv, so everyone can see it. It's a very prominent intersection in Tel Aviv. And as you can see, the billboards say what would have happened if a girl in the Holocaust had Instagram. And in these billboards, what they've created is, of course, a provocation, because you can see the black and white and the barbed wire, which are Holocaust icons and are connected to our image of the Holocaust. But the colors that you see here are the colors of Instagram. And when these billboards were hanged, all hell broke loose in Israel. And this project, even without seeing one frame of the project, was completely and critically debated, and it was negated from every possible side. Youngsters, elderly, and so on. How dare they? How dare they combine the Holocaust with Instagram? How dare they create this fictional film or stories as if a girl in the Holocaust had Instagram? What will they think of next? And alongside the serious critical debate, there was also a lot of mockery. I will only show you few examples out of many others. I'm sure you're all aware of foodies on the internet who upload pictures of food that they eat, and these are potato peels that Jews used to eat during the Holocaust because they didn't have anything else to eat. In the lower part, she asks that somebody here has a charger. In the middle, someone says, "I knew it was a mistake to follow Eva, the girl from the Holocaust, because what we see here is that Adolf Hitler began following his account." You can see here the piles of cellular phones. Again, when we talk about the piles of grasses and hair of a human and so on, which is so familiar from Auschwitz. And the other one says, what if a girl in the Holocaust had Instagram? Well, I guess the Nazis would have confiscated it. So this is the kind of debate. And then May 1st came, and they began uploading the stories from 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Each half an hour, another story. And the numbers grew exponentially by the hours. More and more viewers, more and more followers. As the numbers grew, the wind had changed completely. And during the 1st of May, the 2nd of May, you could have seen other headlines totally, like it's a blessing, it's the first innovating Holocaust memorial thing, better than Yad Vashem, and so on. People went completely rage about it. I can see there is a problem with the presentation, so I'll just keep going. Maybe you can fix it. Okay, I'll just continue. So by the end of the day, okay, thank you. So these are the responses. It's a blessed enterprise and so on. My grandfather would have loved it. And this Holocaust Memorial Day belongs to Eva and not to Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem can learn from it and so on. So the numbers were indeed staggering. You can see here the numbers, unbelievable. Of course, when you see the numbers, you can understand that it were not only Israeli youngsters who watched it. First of all, their statistics show that those who watched it were people between the ages of 13 and 30. But because it was so highly debated in Israel, the foreign correspondent picked up on this and they published it all over the world. And Eva's story was covered in around 75 countries, including Arab countries. So now turning to the initial question, is it a new trajectory in Holocaust memory, or does it cheapen the Holocaust? Now, having watched it, and of course you can watch it as well, you can follow Eva. the story is saved in her highlights. This short film doesn't cheapen the Holocaust at all. It's a very classical narrative of deterioration. Begins when everything's fine and ends by sending to Auschwitz. There's nothing cynical about it or funny about it. It's a very sad Holocaust stories meant for youngsters, meaning there aren't so many atrocities. There aren't any hard to digest images that children cannot watch. So it doesn't cheapen the Holocaust. But is it indeed a new trajectory in Holocaust memory? So as I said earlier, in my opinion, it is not. In my opinion, it is a very successful combination of commemoration methods that have all appeared before, and I'll just give you several examples. First of all, the protagonist perspective. When Mati Kochavi was asked about the novelty of this project, he claimed that in every Holocaust movie he ever saw, the perspective is of the perpetrators. He never sees the point of view of the victims. He said, we see the pictures taken by the Nazis, but I always wanted to know what they, the Jews, saw at that moment. What did Eva feel, for example, when she first put on her yellow badge? The Instagram gives you another perspective, an angle that didn't exist before. Well, this is not completely true, because a scene taken from the protagonist's perspective and even an entire film taken from the protagonist's perspective have all appeared before. I've showed you here some examples of Holocaust films for youngsters or for the whole family, which are very mellow. And in these films, you can find many, many scenes that describe the victim's point of view. And when we talk about older people, we all remember, I believe, the recent film Son of Saul, which was taken all from the victim's perspective as Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. The entire film is filmed as if from the victim's perspective. Now, talking about the combination of Instagram and social media, we already saw it in Professor Feldman's talk. This is nothing new. Meaning, when we talk about this combination of Instagram and Holocaust and social media, we can find it within more than the last decade. We can find several examples. We can find individuals who go to museums and to Holocaust memorial sites and upload their perspective, their pictures, their text, but also the memorial sites themselves and places like Yad Vashem and the Auschwitz Museum and so on. They all have Instagram accounts to which they upload text and pictures and comments and so on. So this is definitely not the first time that there was a combination between the Holocaust and Instagram. And another point is the victim's point of view, or even the dead's victim point of view. It is not the first time that the audience is able to connect with a victim, with a dead victim. In 2010, there was a new Facebook page for Henyo, one of the kids, one of the children who were murdered in the Holocaust. And to that page, the one who opened the page uploaded text and photos as if from Henyo's perspective. And the audience was welcome to address it and respond to Henyo himself. And we've heard from Professor Feldman and many others about Holocaust holograms. This is not on social media, but this is another way to interact with somebody who's not in the room, and of course, after their lifetimes. I can go on and on about the way that people address the protagonist who talks to them as if breaking the fourth wall. This is something that is to be found in youngsters' TV from the 90s and so on. And there are many other examples. But since our time is short, let me just summarize. So first of all, again, as I've mentioned, the numbers are staggering. I don't know if we can estimate the influence of the project on youngsters. People follow Eva, people responded to her, and people saw the project, but whether they've forgotten about it 5 minutes later and when they move to other stories, or whether it made a really big impact on their souls, I don't think that we can know it. So the numbers-wise, it was a great success. But again, within the context of 70 years of Holocaust commemoration in Israel, I do not think it's a new approach in Holocaust memory. I do think it's a very successful combination of representational methods that have appeared before. the protagonist's perspective, Holocaust on social media, the ability of the audience to connect with the victims, this breaking of the fourth wall, etc. When we look at the narrative itself, when we look at Eva's stories as a short film, like you can find it today, what you see is a very classic narrative of deterioration that Israeli adolescents learn about from elementary school. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Livny. I think that we will discuss this topic again during ending discussion at the end of the session. And I would like to introduce the fourth speaker, is Dr. GANOR. GANOR is the founder and since 1994 director of Mashmaut Center in Kiryat Motzkin, as well as a social historian and researcher of the Holocaust, Israeli society and Israeli defense forces. She works also at the Spiegel Fellow, the Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research and at Bar-Ilan University. She holds her PhD from Bar-Ilan. Her doctoral dissertation dealt with the Israeli Defense Forces and the Holocaust. She has been awarded a postdoctoral grant from Haifa University. She received also Yad Vashem Award of Excellence in the field of Holocaust education in 2000, and in 2017 she was awarded for lifetime achievements by municipality of Kiryat Motzkin. The title of her presentation is Practices of Remembering and Oblivion, Life Stories of Holocaust Survivor, Aircrew members in the Israeli Air Forces, a case study. So the floor is yours.
For being here, and I would like to start with the presentation. First, the first slide, please, if you can present it. This research focuses on practices of remembering and oblivion in life stories of Holocaust survivors, aircrew members in the Israeli Air Force. Please, second slide. In the mid 50s, the approximately 300 members served at the key points. Please, the next slide, please. The next slide. Thank you. As I said, the approximately 300 aircrew members served at key points of decision-making within the Israeli Air Force, IAF, included 136 Holocaust survivors. In addition, of the 285 aircrew members who took part in the 1956 Sinai War, 33% were Holocaust survivors. During their service in the IAF, most of them remained silent about their experience during the Holocaust out of a desire to be like their Israeli-born colleagues, even at the price of burying their own personal experience. For example, in my personal story, I kept my personal story close to my chest. Like cards, I didn't share it with anyone. It's known that I am not the only one who kept quiet. This entire amazing group kept quiet, some more than others. Everyone felt foreign to the Israeli way of life, and everyone made a great effort to forget the past, to be like their friends, and to blend into Israeliness. Some succeeded and some failed, said Shaya Harsit. Please, the next slide. In the early statehood, pilot considered model of Zionist Sabra heroism. Please, next slide. The image was reinforced after 1956 war. This was the first war which jet planes participated, and the Air Force played a crucial role in the war. Against the background of the shortage of manpower in the late 50s, Ezer Weizman, Air Force commander at that time and later President of the State of Israel, coined the phrase, the best go to the skies. No one mentioned the fact that approximately 1/3 of the pilots who took part in the fighting were Holocaust survivors. In their late 70s and 80s, some members of this group began sharing memories of their personal experiences during and following the Holocaust. I had the privilege to interview 35 members of this group, Aircrew members, all of whom were born between 1927 and 1942, and experienced the horrors of the Holocaust as children. After the war, these individuals faced with many challenges, including difficulties being absorbed into society in their new country. All of them volunteered to the Air Force and served during the 50s and 60s, as I mentioned. Many members of this group, which is part of the legacy of the IAF and the State of Israel, link their decision to be pilots to their experience in the Holocaust. Please, next slide. To understand their transformation from exilic children and Holocaust refugees, the antithesis of the image of the Sabra fighters, into members of the leading elite in the Air Force and the State of Israel, I analyzed the major themes that emerged in the memories they shared during their interviews in historical, social, and cultural context. This analysis is based on 35 stories of the interviewees and the Israeli national story. Both reflect the Holocaust and the personal and national rebirth of each of the interviewees and their changing consequences of the years. Like a jigsaw puzzle, the different stories produced a consistent and complex account of the phenomenon. The methodological discussion considered a number of questions. What was the fate of these children during the following and the Holocaust? How did their fate during the Holocaust influence their desire to analyze specifically in the Air Force and their motivation to volunteer for pilots training? What were the factors that contributed to their integration and success in the IAF and Israeli society? Please, next slide. Testimony taken directly from survivors raises the question of the reliability of memories conveyed decades after the event themselves. After all, memory has potential to disappoint. This study is not aimed to researching the historical truth. Rather, it is an effort to focus on the memories and views of the survivors. The interviewees were accompanied by fears regarding the opening of age-old wounds and the concern that perhaps it would be better to leave the past in the past. Other challenges resulted from my desire to preserve the uniqueness of each story while at the same time creating a common narrative. For this reason, I decided to present the life stories through a discussion based on the main contact questions that were asked in the interviews, and to both characterize the main themes and highlight the themes that are expansional. Please, next slide. The study presents the first documentary research regarding this group as an entity whose members share the common denominator, their identity and experience as children who survived the Holocaust and subsequently become IAF crew members. It is also increases awareness regarding the gap between their childhood and their present, and of course being pilots after that in the State of Israel. So this helps us to understand the sociological and historical process that shaped the face of the country. In addition, this paper enlarges our knowledge regarding the IAF during its establishment and presents it as a warm home and helps equal opportunities, ideology, and sense of purpose and mission, even among those who had difficulties experienced as children. Next slide, please. So what memories emerge in those life stories? Pre-war period. Despite their young ages, we could find some memories. Several themes occur on these interviewees: the economic situation, education, connection to religions, and the relationship with neighbors, with non-Jewish neighbors, and a relationship with the parents. I will not bring now examples because we don't have time, but only one because it's very, connected to the place. GBN from Warsaw. He was a child in the ghetto, in Warsaw Ghetto, and he was hidden. So his memory was, my parents came from a wealthy family. The strongest memory I have from home is a birthday party that they celebrated me when I was 2 or 3 years old. I received a tricycle. Next slide. War memories were traumatic and formative. Whenever they survived, please, next slide. The memories, whatever they survived on their own or with their family. First war experience. For example, the opening event of my childhood during the Holocaust was horrific. The German came to my grandfather's house and beat my grandfather. I will never forget that picture of my grandfather laying on the wooden floor in a puddle of blood mixed with jam. Difficult separation from family, parents, from father, from mother, and they saw sometimes the father as a leader, the mother as extraordinary person, and the challenges for surviving: fear, hunger, cold, hiding places, sense of persecution, family and individual difficulties, efforts to live normal life during the Holocaust. Holocaust experience was very strong in their minds, and especially the efforts that the family made to live normal life in such a horrible time. Another example, my uncle was caught. I did not see how they killed him. I became an animal whose sole aim was survival, and there was nothing that I was not willing to do. I was 6 years old boy, like an animal, and then like an animal, I did everything. I stole, pimped, lied, whatever you want. And this child after becomes a pilot, and a pilot in the Air Force, and then after a pilot in El Al. I would like to emphasize the mother. So next slide, please. The mother bravery. The mother was a significant figure who saved life and was extraordinarily brave. I remember arriving to Auschwitz. They took us to the showers. They shaved our heads. This is the only situation that is branded in my memory that I won't ever forget. That is the moment. Head shone with clothes. They left me my shoes. Those were the shoes that my mother had bought for me for a kilogram of rice. The most difficult thing was the shame and humiliation. I will never forget that moment. And another example, please, next slide. My mother managed to escape from camp when she was 34 with a young boy. And then there was a horrific moment when a 14-year-old girl managed to crawl out of the window and jumped from the train. At the awful moment, she shouted to my mother, "Throw him to me." My mother held me up and threw me out of the window. My mother was a hero. She decided to give me away to save me. My aunt was a hero. These two women, my mother and my aunt, saved their children. I have more examples, but we don't have time, and I would like to go to the period after the war, which I call it the war after the war. Please, next slide. This period was a lot of challenges, coping with the post-war reality, facing their loss, loneliness, and emptiness. Liberation Day was significant memory and the period of wandering until they immigrated to Israel. The different setting in which they were placed affected the choices they made. They describe the effect on their identity of those youth movement and Zionist ideology that they encountered immediately after the war, and how they helped them to cope with their Holocaust trauma. Despite the difficulties, they remember this period as a positive period. Those who survived with their parents remember their parents' behavior and response to the discovery of the loss after the war. On one hand, it was happy, the liberation, but on the other hand, the enormous grief over the loss, loneliness, being uprooted and homeless, and the knowledge that they have no home to return to. Sometimes these children were forced to part from their parents again, and because they arrived to Israel before the parents. Those who survived without their parents found themselves completely alone and try to fit into their new environment. Next slide, please. I would like to talk about the Aliyah, immigration to Israel, which included many difficulties such as new language, loneliness problem, adjusting to various new setting. The emotion tool of integration into Israeli society included adoption, a new identity, and starting new life. Still, for some fundamental events such as Eichmann trial affected their attitude to the Holocaust and to the memories. They felt like refugees, and I would like to give two examples because we don't have time. I registered for the first grade, and they called me the refugee. The kids did not accept me. I didn't know the language, I didn't fit in, and no one helped me. And my whole youth, I never wanted to remember the Holocaust. On the contrary, I wanted to forget it. I joined to the Tel Aviv Scout. The aviation club became my home. I fit in very well. After Gadna, I went to the aviation club. We would go to Sde Dov airfield every Saturday. So you can see that they wanted to very much to integrate, and they did everything to integrate, even it cost them to not to forget the past. Please, next slide. Factors that facilitated the integration. Two main factors helped them to integrate: life kibbutz and the Air Force. Life in the kibbutz was a fundamental experience that had a major contribution to their integration and success. Life in the kibbutz made it possible for them to become similar to the Sabra, to the native, and fit in. On the kibbutz, they had opportunity to shade the marks of the diaspora, and life on the kibbutz strengthened their ties to Israel. Next slide. The Air Force, please, next slide. The Air Force and motivation to volunteering. Their Holocaust experience was very important in their decision to volunteer. For example, changing from a humiliated child in the Holocaust to a child who belongs to the top elite of the State of Israel. Maybe a brigadier general in the Air Force will grow out of that shame and humiliation in Auschwitz. If I manage to go from yellow star to a Star of David on my chest, of David on my chest to a blue Star of David on my wings, then what more does a person need? So I would like to come to the end of the lecture. Please, next slide. I founded reciprocal relation, personal rebirth and the Air Force, from rebirth to the sky. Appreciation and gratitude to the Air Force for its role in their personal revival. During my 22 years of service in the Air Force, I served the country loyally, with devotion, and at the same time I know that the country and the Air Force gave me much more than I gave them. Summary and conclusion, please, next slide. This study exposed the myth that the Air Force officers who served in the 50s and the 60s, the best to disguise, were Israeli-born Sabra. Although they came over there and survived the horrors of the Holocaust, they also completely identified with their mission as airmen and had the same passion for the Air Force and sense of mission as their Israeli-born friends. They so strongly identified with the Air Force that even their desire to come together as a group and tell the story of their past is based on their strong ties to the Air Force. Even today, the Air Force continues to offer a warm, supportive setting for this research project known as From Rivers to the Skies. Their silence was a brick wall with intentional cracks. Their avoidance of discussion of their past and new identity they built for themselves were major factors in their success. Yet, in certain situations, they were flooded by the memories and thoughts of their past. Despite of the relatively disadvantaged starting point they had because of the circumstances of their childhood, they had strong ambition to succeed. This glaring contrast between their difficulties childhood and their notable success as commanders in the Air Force can be explained by the following factors. Their pride in playing a role in building and defending the state of Israel, the fact that the Air Force was their home and their family enlarged their willingness to make contribution and promoted their successful integration in the Air Force in the Israeli society. Next slide. Their personal stories and the national story are intertwined, representing the Holocaust and the national individual revival of all the interviewees. The individual story come together to create a complex description of the phenomenon. This life stories teaches us about personal and collective memory, the dynamics of loss, wandering, return, and rehabilitation. In effect, their stories are a summary of some of the most important chapters in Jewish history. And the last chapter, the last slide, sorry, the heritage of the Holocaust survivor, Aircrew member, is an oral history that offers is in history that offers knowledge and insight anyone interested in understanding the unique contribution to the Air Force, to the rebirth of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. I hope this study will become an important source of information to anyone who is interested in learning more about this topic. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to introduce the last speaker, is Lior Inbar, who is affiliated with the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, where he is a guide and group facilitator, as well as the content editor of the Yom HaShoah Memorial Assembly. He is also a guest lecturer in a variety of topics related to the history of Israeli politics and culture. He is author of several articles, including Kibbutz Lochamei Ghetto, a site of memory in a challenging reality, 1949-1959. And today he's going to speak about Lochamei Ghetto archive, and the title of his presentation is The Ghetto Fighters House Archive in Israel, 1950-2020. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. And a blessing for Dr. GANOR, who just heard, that's received lately the Knight Cross from the Polish ambassador here in Israel, so best regard for that. I would like today to take us to a short journey in time to the early beginning of the Ghetto Fighter House Museum, in particular the archive. And you can see here a painting by Isaac Feder from Drancy from 1942. I tell you later on why I choose to start with Isaac Feder. But first of all, let's see in few chapters, short chapters, the story of this unique place. All right, so here you can see two persons. One was mentioned earlier, Yitzhak Antek Zuckerman, one of the heads of the Jewish Fighting Organization in Warsaw and Warsaw Ghetto. And the other one is a key figure also, Dr. Adolf Avram Berman. He was the head of the Jewish National Committee in Warsaw and representative of the Jewish and the Zagota Council. So you can see those two people once in Warsaw in April 1946, the commemoration for the third year of the Ghetto of Warsaw Uprising. And exactly 3 years later, here in Israel, in the kibbutz, Lochamei Getaot, again, April 1949. And this day in particular, it was the 18th of April, was not just a commemoration of the ghetto fighters uprising, it was also the beginning of the kibbutz, Lochamei Getaot. And it's really a journey, I can say, it's the largest exodus by many ways in the modern area of the Jewish people. And those two people will be part of my lecture today. In particular, it will be Adolf Berman, an example is part of his collection here in our archive. The idea was quite a vast idea, since they established a kibbutz with a very strange name, as I mentioned, Lochamei Getaot, ghetto fighters. They established a ceremony, a commemoration ceremony, which was the cornerstone of all the memory of the Holocaust in Israel. And they also decided that they will open a museum. And they opened the museum in 1950. And with the museum, they opened also the archive altogether. And you can see a testimony by Sarah Schneer, was a former partisan and later educator and a Holocaust researcher. And as she said many years afterwards, every member who joined us brought something from home, a piece of clothing, photographs of relatives. We collected it all and logged the items, and slowly, eventually, we call it a museum. That was a start, and you can see from the left side, you can see also Zvi Schneer that was mentioned earlier. Zvi Schneer was the director of the Ghetto Fighters Museum for many, many years. And you can say that if you can look on those people, there are two power couples that were here. One was Zvi and Sarah Schneer, and the other one, I mentioned also, it's Yitzhak Zuckerman, but obviously his wife, Tzivia Lubetkin. And while the Zuckermans brought the fame, the glory of the revolt, Tzvi and Sarah was the daily life of this museum, from this archive in specific, for many, many years. But it's not enough. I mean, to collect things from the people of the kibbutz is not enough. And they understood that they have to go to the public. And while they are called the public in Israel to donate everything they can possibly give that connected to the Holocaust, they also publish these articles, first, I will say, the PIM. And you can see here that this in 1951, it's must say, understanding, a very early understanding that it's not enough. It's not enough to collect documents. You have to publish them. You have to call the public to donate more things to the archive, and later on to publish it and call for a researcher to do a research in those items. And again, not enough. Another couple, not a married couple, but an interesting couple, was the Yitzhak Katzenelson, the poet, and a younger lady whose name was Miriam Novich. They met each other in the Vitel camp in France in 1943. He arrived there with his son from Warsaw Ghetto. She arrived there from Paris. She was a member of the communist underground in Paris. And he and his son later on were sent to Auschwitz and murdered there. And Miriam Novich devoted her life, she said, to collect the tears of the Jewish people, as she promised the poet. And if you look, I mean, our audience, if you want to investigate or to research a unique person in the Holocaust commemoration, no doubt that Miriam Novich was it. This is a slide of her private personal diary that are in archive. To enlighten the world, there must be a flame burning within you. Again, she was communist. That's why one of the first donation of the for art collection here in the Ghetto Fighters House, she went to Paris to the widow of Isaac Feder, and she was also a communist, and his painting are here for almost 70 years. They are in our archive. Another thing that Miriam Novich brought us was the work, the amazing work, I must say, the underground work of Josef Richter. We don't know much about him. He was a Pole. He worked probably on the railroad trails in Poland during the war. And you can see here what he signed on what he would picture us from Trevniki. And I want to take us for a short walk to Trevniki by example from one letter that was donated by Adolf Berman. Adolf Berman, that I mentioned earlier, was later become a Knesset member in Israel. And a few years before he passed away, he donated to us all his archive, which is amazing. It's all of them is online on through our website. So one example, one letter from the Berman collection. This is a story, an unknown story, that I have a privilege a few years ago to research with my colleagues here in the archive, Noam Rachmilevich, he is the expertise of the Berman archive. And it's a story about the days after the ghetto uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It's a story about the camps in the Lublin district, and a story about a cooperation between two underground organizations, the ZOB and the ZZV, yes, the Jewish fighting organization and the Jewish military organization. And two people, one is Dr. Zev Shifris from the ZBO, and the other one is attorney David Schulman, a revisionist from the ZZV. And they both wrote a letter, a very interesting letter to Berman, which was in the Aryan side of Warsaw at this time. And I brought here this letter for you. 1 second. Yes, so the letter from Blodek to Dolek. Yeah, that's the names, the underground names. 2nd of October, 1943. And this is what Shifris wrote, and almost prayed about the liquidation of the Budzin camp, another camp in this area. We are immediately awaiting a clarification of this matter, as you have received a letter from Eliezer Lipa Bloch and from Wodobinsky. David Wodobinsky was the top leader, the most important leader of the Revisionists in Poland. He was nominated by Zev Jabotinsky a few years later. And it's mentioned also here the rabbi from Piaseczna and Shimon Stukheimer, another rabbi. As you can see, it's written here, if a rescue shipment will not be arranged, we will never see any of these people again. Everything must be done to rescue them. Therefore, money is required. And he said, we need money. And again, we need money. You must write postcard to us about how much you are able to continue aiding us. Wouldn't it be better to cut the support and leave it all up to the fate? I'm asking you to make contact with Comrade Antek, Itzhak Zuckerman, and inform him that we are making efforts to send people to position. We'll make contact and inform him of this. And on the other side of this letter wrote Schulman. Yeah, that's the other side of the letter, again to Dolek, to Berman. And you can see what Schulman, the revisionist, wrote. All indicates that the camp is being liquidated. If you could do something to come up with an arrangement for our women, if you would make our work easier, I will keep up the camp chronic until the last moment. I do not know whether it's worth continue to edit it. I mean, it's quite amazing. There's always a say, especially by late Professor Misha Arens, that the Zezavu and the ZOB are always, couldn't stand each other and always have, an inter-Jewish fight. And you can see in this, this letter is part of a larger collection in the Berman collection, that those people cooperate with each other. The end for this story, at least from the Berman collection, is quite sad because exactly a month later, on the 3rd of November, it was what's called the Ernfest, and all those camps, Poniatova, Majdanek, Budzin, and of course Revniki were all murdered. The only survivor from this correspond is Dr. David Wadobinsky that I mentioned. He later on he was one of the witnesses on the Eichmann trial. So I want to finish with something more optimistic from our archive. It's a story of a napkin, a handkerchief from Zvonshin, what my grandmother used to call in Polish chusteczka. Well, this handkerchief was here in our archive, was donated for many years ago, and you can see on the handkerchief, you can see the handwriting and all kind of inscription. It was made by Bernard Gelbart, Dan Gelbart, who later on became one of the top Israeli graphic designer. But we only knew that who donated, but nothing more than that. And about 2 months ago, during the COVID situation, I received a call from Anat Bratman El, which is the director of our archive. And she asked me, Lior, do you know by any chance Isaac Zaleshinsky from Kibbutz Evron? And I told her, yes, of course, I know him all my life. I mean, he was a neighbor of my grandmother that I mentioned. And all of a sudden, and all this story became much more important, since the Berlin Museum, the Jewish Museum, in Berlin, asked her, who is Isaac Zaleshinsky? So immediately I called the archive in my kibbutz, and all of a sudden we got all the details. And he passed away already, but in an interview with him during the 80s, he said that he was sent to Zvonshin by Dr. Immanuel Ringblum with the joint efforts to help those refugees there in Zvonshin. And all of a sudden, a story that napkin, a handkerchief that's here for many, many years, got more details and more information from this person, Isaac Zaleshinsky, who donated here this for many, many years. And in your permission, really, will finish my presentation, but if you can close the presentation, since I'm not today in Warsaw and I'm in our archive, I will show to the camera the chustechka, the handkerchief. I brought it, so if you can just close the presentation and you can see it, I will put it on the camera if it's okay by you. You can close the presentation? I will close the presentation?
Yeah.
All right, I'll close the presentation. All right. So that's the handkerchief. Again, for many, many years, an interesting story that's kept here in our archive. So thank you all, and see you later.
Thank you very much, and thank you for, you see, the end of your presentation. Usually we use such chusteczka to say farewell, so maybe it was really appropriate object, and the presentation given by Lior Inbar was the last one during this session. Thank you for very interesting papers, and many fascinating issues were raised, both of a psychological and historical nature, relating both to the post-war past and the present time. So I think this is excellent material for an interesting discussion. So I would like to add that on our website you can find video presentation prepared by Eliana Adler from Pennsylvania State University. This is also part of our session. And very sad information, unfortunately, our commentator Anna Sommer-Schneider is sick, so we don't have, you see, commentator comments to the whole session. But anyway, we have opportunity to discuss and to ask questions. And the first question I would like to address to Sharon ZELNICK, our first speaker. I think that this is the question which was asked very frequently. What was the reaction of this movie on White City? In Israel, I can expect, but maybe it's not so simply. But what was the reaction in Germany? Could you tell something about that?
Sure. I think that it was well received in both Israel and in Germany. I mean, it's obviously quite a controversial film, but I think among the community to which Gal was presenting it, which is primarily other artists and academics and activists in Berlin and likewise in Israel, it was generally well received, and I think a part of a bigger project that I'm looking into. As I mentioned, this is just one case study, but I have others through which many Israelis are exploring these issues and connecting memories and post-memories of both the Holocaust and the Nakba. So there was definitely, I'm sure he received some criticism because of the controversial nature of the film and the content and his stance, but for the most part it was well received, and it continues to be useful today, and he's come out with other films. This is part of a trilogy, but all of his films, even the ones that aren't part of this trilogy, do deal with issues of memory and trauma. But what's interesting is that his focus on this, and most of these authors and artists that I will continue to look at, they end up focusing on the Holocaust only once they get to Germany, once they move there, as opposed to the prior work that he and other artists and authors do before they move doesn't necessarily deal with that subject.
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting situation. So you see, I'm a historian, and Berlin was a very popular destination among Polish Jews before the war and also after the war. The crucial part of Jewish community in Berlin just after the war were Jews from the peace camps or from Poland. So I think that this fascination has 19th century background. I don't think that it's time to speak about that, but anyway, related to your lecture, I was really surprised that, or maybe not, that so many members of the third generations decided to emigrate, to emigrate to Germany. We can say that it's completely different country at the moment, but when I think about Germany after the war, sometimes I don't understand people who decided to emigrate there just after the war. Yeah, I think is very difficult to compare. Do you think that history still play important role among, you see, this German Israeli diaspora in Berlin?
Yes, history absolutely plays a very central role. But there is a lot of also backlash from oftentimes the parents or the grandparents of these migrants when they decide to move to Germany in light of the very difficult past, their own experiences there. Yael Ruveni's documentary project kind of sheds light on this difficulty, and there's a lot of work that I'll continue to look at that explores the historical dimensions and difficulties. But I think it's precisely because of what happened in this contested space that makes it now a place that provokes this post-memorial engagement and work. And also it enables a type of, I think, a different type of environment to explore more controversial issues like Gal and a lot of the other artists and authors that I'm looking at tend to do. But the historical dimension is absolutely there. Gal, he spent a lot of time researching for this project, and for all of his projects he does extensive research in different archives, and he just spent this past summer at the Wiesenthal Institute in Vienna. And so yeah, his history is absolutely central, and it's absolutely the choice for these migrants to move to, for these Israelis to migrate to Germany is definitely something that is controversial among their families, and something that is, I think, both challenging and liberating to them.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much. And maybe short remark addressed to Weronika. ROMANIK. So I would like to ask you, because in your lecture you stress you see relatively small corrections. You punctuations mark titles of documents, which sometimes the changes play really important role. But do you find have you found such, you see, how to say more visible corrections? I can give you an example. When we compare the edition of Emanuela Ringelblum diary in Polish, this is a chronicle. It was published in Polish and in Yiddish, and in version published in Blättervergeschichte, it was the whole text, but in the Polish version, where I skip usually the passages concerning sometimes Poles, sometimes Soviet Union. Do you see such? You see missing places also in this edition, which you compare during your work?
Thank you very much for this question. I know that this is the most attractive part, probably, for many people. But I would like to start with the comment that I am very happy to be a part of this conference, because during her presentation, Katarzyna Persson, she was talking about the archive of Ringelblum, and exactly towards the end of her presentation, she mentioned this issue, that it would be fascinating to compare different censorship omissions in different, even in one context of Polish Jews living in Warsaw, or so in one social cultural context. And I totally agree. This is exactly the premise of my approach, because I am interested in the theoretical framework of memory and cultural memory, especially. And this is exactly the premise of this approach, to envision such comparative analysis, because I know that these all small omissions, like or invisible, not visible if we are used to the old patterns, let's say. Because in many fields, of course, the in literary studies, in history of art, in history, in many other fields, people do compare different alterations. Yes, alterations of one narrative. But the question is, how do we do that? And I propose this cultural micro-memory approach as the solution, as the combination of cultural memory, that is kind of collective memory that is encoded in external carriers, for example, in a book, and the connection to narrative analysis and reduction criticism. And this is a very thorough analysis of all these details that seem irrelevant for many historians, because I know that it's the first thing to do for a historian before she is publishing the source, is to compare more or less the editions. But the thing is that the small details are very meaningful, and this is what I stress in the approach that I presented today, because I propose some theoretical framework to deal with exactly with these problems, and why it is a transdisciplinary approach, because we can different categories that will be the outcomes of analysis, even in different fields. It is possible to compare them owing to this perspective, this cultural micro-memory perspective. So basically, I suggest here the theoretical framework to do such comparative analysis. And I would like to stress one more point that is very important: factors of memory and the socio-cultural context of creating, of production of this medium of memory. So the whole context of negotiation about the book, it's usually the product of negotiations between the editors, translators, the whole editorial team. And this is fascinating. It may be a fascinating field for research, and not only in the terms of editorial teams, which can be researched separately, but also in terms of archives. There are so many untold, different, very interesting issues in this social cultural context that is so crucial for cultural memory. And this messaging, because memory is about communication. So everything, this relation with the past, and this is a very, I see a huge potential in this field. And when it comes to the specific examples, yes, I found such specific examples, concrete examples, and I must say that I was surprised because Tenenbaum's works are quite controversial in many points. And actually, I would I could think that there will be more omissions, more things edited out. And actually, it was very, there were omissions, but they were quite tiny things in comparison to all this criticism of Tenenbaum. It was critical towards many different groups in the ghetto, towards some people, even towards himself, or towards, for example, Yishuv in Israel, in Palestine at that time, the American diaspora. He's critical on many levels. But maybe let me keep it for a book project.
Okay, thank you very much. The subject is very interesting to me. I am an author of several analyses of the Polish history textbooks, and the presentation of Holocaust in the Polish school textbooks. So yeah, it is that's present the historical policy of the state. As I remember, you see, after 1968, some chapters were you see skipped and some were added, mainly about the help offered to Jews by Poles during the Second World War. So for this reason, this is really very interesting to compare. And I wish you great success. And I'm waiting also for a full edition of Tenenbaum Diary.
I do work on that. So.
Okay. And the question to next speaker, to LIAT STEIR-LIVNY. Thank you for interesting speech about Eva's stories and its campaign. Do you consider it is a successful campaign in terms that it raised the awareness about the Holocaust in the Israeli society? Do you think that we should implement other projects in the future similar to Eva's stories?
Well, thank you for your question.
We got this question. I don't know. Yeah.
I think we have to separate between the Israeli audience and people outside of Israel, because when we talk about Israel, children in Israel learn about the Holocaust since kindergarten, through their elementary school and then high school and then the army and so on. So Israel, in my opinion, is a unique place of intense Holocaust awareness. So I'm not sure how much it added to their knowledge, but it sure talked to them because it talked in their language. What it did do is approach youngsters outside of Israel. What they did during the film is that they filmed the actors talking in English, which was supposed to be an Hungarian accent, and Hebrew subtitles were added later in editing. So people outside Israel could have watched it as well and understand. And in these parts of the world, which are not Israel, I think it has a great importance because there are many places in which people are completely unaware of the Holocaust. They do not believe the numbers. They think that maybe Holocaust deniers are right and Jews only were killed during a war and so on. And so when approaching youngsters outside Israel, I think he did a really great job. Again, I don't know how we can assess how it affected them. If they remember it, if it's changed their worldview, if they've forgotten about it after 2 hours because they went on dealing with other stuff on Instagram. I'm not sure that we can know it until we wait several years, maybe more than several years, and then ask them if they remember it and how it affected them. Regarding similar projects, there is already a new project by the Anna Frank House in Amsterdam, in which the heroine, the protagonist, an actor, plays Anna Frank, and she introduces her life through a vlog, meaning a video blog, which is also highly popular among youngsters. So yeah, I'm sure it's going to affect many more because of the staggering number and its enormous success. And if it really makes the Holocaust more accessible for youngsters, then great. But again, I think we can treat it as a very successful combination of previous commemoration methods. And if it talks to the youngsters and helps them understand it, so be it. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we will see. But anyway, maybe it is a good way to educate. You see, the personal story is usually much more moving that you see such general stories. And huge numbers sometimes sounds like nothing, and individual story is much more moving, in my opinion, especially for teenagers. And the question to GANOR. You see, I had opportunity to see your whole lecture because you sent a paper version to organizers, and I have found there something to me a little bit controversial. You see, you mentioned that in your opinion, these kids, these children who survived the Holocaust and start to make their career in Israeli Air Forces, they change from passive victims during the Holocaust to active fighting soldiers. I have a little bit different view of the situation because, in my opinion, the struggle for life during the Holocaust and survival was a sign of great strength and of this children. And I think that Holocaust experiences strengthen them. You see, I can compare people who spent, you see, many years in Siberia, in Soviet camps, lager. So they used to say, if I survive in Siberia, I can do everything. And I would like to ask you, Leah, if you agree with me or you see that from completely different perspective.
Yes, I can answer in different perspectives.
Yeah.
From one hand, yes, if the Holocaust survivors that I meet even today, they said, if I survive the Holocaust, so what else can be hard for me? Nothing can be hard. But they were children during the Holocaust. And when they came to the state of Israel, the Israeli society looked at them not only suspicious, but also from patronized, because the Israeli natives They were, educated to be strong, to be healthy, and who came from there, from the diaspora, especially after the Holocaust, and he was not a fighter in the partisan or ghetto fighter. They looked at him in a very negative way. So the children felt, even they suffered during the Holocaust, but they were very vulnerable, it did not strengthen them. They did not take it as a tool for being more stronger. Maybe now, after many, many years, from a perspective of years, they can say, if I survived the Holocaust, so nothing can be hard for me. But then, as a child that was humiliated, with lots of loneliness, with lots of thoughts of, difficult experiences, they did not feel strong. They did not. Because there is a big difference between Holocaust survivors that gone through the Holocaust as adults or even teenagers than children. So they felt very weak. They felt very weak. But after, when they integrated in the, after the years in the kibbutz, or maybe some of them in other places, and they went to the Air Force, then they felt something like, stronger, because they had uniform, they had a purpose, they had ideology, and they were in the training course of pilots, which was the elite of the elite in the Israeli society. Then, and even today, they counted very as an elite group, and they wanted to be like their friend the Sabras, and the Sabras accepted them as equal when they were with the uniform, when they were with the wings, not as children after the Holocaust, because nobody listened to them. They did not tell anyone. They did not want to share the experience, because the attitude of the society was not as you are strong, as you are a strong child, you are a weak, you are nothing. I hope I answered you. I hope.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You see, in the Jewish Historical Institute, in the archive, there is a huge collection of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland. And one of the division, this is, I don't remember the name of this division. It was something like children care or something like this. There are memoirs of kids. Yeah, very, very tragical. Yeah. So I understand. Yeah, maybe now this view of post-war situation is a little bit different. That just
especially
after,
in the young state of Israel.
yeah.
And there were many changes. You see, only in the last 10 years they started to talk. They did not tell even friends, even commander and his deputy. Both of them were Holocaust survivors, but nobody told each other about the past. Nobody knew it. And even today, some of them, said, wow, he was a Holocaust survivor? He was my guide in training pilot course. I never thought he was a Holocaust survivor. I thought he's Aryeh from Tel Aviv, because they changed also names.
I see.
They had Israeli names, and all the attitude, all the performance there. And what is paradoxical, when I interview them, really they are more than 80. It was some years ago, and they look good, handsome, tall people. You never could say that they were Holocaust survivors. And the last interview I made with a person that, to me, he looked like the strongest person over the world, handsome, tall, with blue eyes, with a lot of gray hair. He was a hero during the time of service. After in El Al, he was a pilot. But it was my last interview, and his story, when he started to tell the story, he told me something that I could not proceed the interview. And he said, I must finish the interview. But it was not ghetto, it was not concentration camp. He was hidden in, in some place. And the difficulties he had as a child If I have 2 minutes, I can tell it because it's anonymous, if you allow me. He said to
Okay.
me, if there is 2 minutes, yes? He
Yes,
said
yes,
to
of
me,
course.
you can understand me because my wife is a native Israeli with many generations of her family. Never she can understand me because I cannot throw bread. And I cannot see when my wife is throwing bread. One day, I saw my wife throwing bread. When she went to sleep, I went outside and I started to go look at the garbage to find the piece of bread. You can imagine me. I am the brigadier general, how you call it, was very decorated, a hero. Me, I find myself as a homeless, looking at the garbage, and I found the bread. I took the bread, I went back home, I washed it, I put in the oven, and I ate it. So now you decide, he said to me, am I a hero or not? And he started to cry, and the interview finished.
You see, I understand this story because this is also very typical habit in Poland. Never throw even small piece of bread, and I also not able to do that. Even I don't have such experiences, but I understand. And you see, I have a lot of friends in Israel, and they usually have full refrigerator of food, and they usually afraid, oh, we don't have enough food, we have to go shopping. Yeah, yes, I understand that, and I understand this example. Yeah. And Lai, I just got a next question to you. This is the question concerning interviews you made with Holocaust survivors. Do your interviews talk to each other about experiences, or they just talk to you because you were an outside person, as you mentioned?
They did not talk about their experience. They talked with me because I'm an outside person and I made the research. And I think it was for them the time they wanted somehow to talk. It took me a long process to persuade many of them to open up and to speak. Sometimes it was the first time they spoke about their experience from the Holocaust, and even their wives sometimes sat with them and they said to me, I'm married with this man 50 years, never I saw him
I see.
crying or telling this story. What did you do to them? I said, I did not do anything, only ask questions.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Lior Inbar. You presented this napkin. It's really very interesting object. So we discussed this topic today. And I would like to ask you, as a historian, do you still receive a lot of original objects to your archive and to your museum in
Yes,
Lochameich
we do.
Ghetto? Yeah?
Yeah,
What kind?
it's amazing.
Yeah. So please tell something more.
I will tell you. Letters, postcards, painting, diaries. I mean, it's an ongoing process. And we see that, the children today is the children or the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivor that kept them. And after years, they decided that come the time that you have to donate it, they want to donate it to our archive. And it's an interesting process because they become a really good connection between the non-donators and our staff here. We translate them. We put them in the internet with their permission, of course. And it's really, I believe, it's give opportunity to those material, that were in sometimes in a shoebox at home or in a drawer. And all of a sudden, this story became, public. And I think the most interesting thing is the fact that the personal details of a story, of a person, all of a sudden are part of something much larger, of a history process, and this is only, one or two part of this puzzle, this amazing puzzle, and it's fascinating every time, once and again and again. So it's keep going, and please do so for everyone who hear us. We are here.
Okay. It's very good news. And another question to you.
Sure.
Could you reflect on the question of Holocaust memory and digital media in the context of Ghetto Fighters House Museum and Archives? It seems that your museum is based on the collection and archive of authentic objects and artifacts. How do you face challenges of digital media and such projects as Eva Stories in the context of practices of museum activities?
It's an interesting question. Actually, until today, we didn't have any opportunity to receive such works like the Eva project. But I think that the answer is in the beginning of your question. What do we see as the most important thing are the originals, of course, the original documents and artifactual, of course. And since we are, as I said earlier, we have put them already on the digital website, so it's all available. So it's original and it's available. And I don't know. I mean, as I heard Professor LIVNY earlier, perhaps in a year to come, somebody will decide that this EVA project, for example, or the Anne Frank, the project that we just heard about him, it could be also part of our archive in years to come. I really don't know.
I think that, you see, the sense of the question is a little bit different. So do you implement many virtual multimedia, you see, installations on your exhibition? Yes. But you have objects.
Yeah, I'll tell you, if it's okay, in your permission, a short story.
Yeah, of course.
In our exhibition of Warsaw Ghetto, for example, that was opened 2 years ago, and at the moment, unfortunately, since the COVID situation, it's closed to the public. We decided that we're going to take actors, and we're going to give them the originals, whether it's letter or testimonies or a diary of whether I mentioned earlier Yitzhak Zuckerman or David Wadubinski that just mentioned, and I mean, Steve Lubetkin and everyone else, or even Władysław Schlengel, the poet Władysław Schlengel, or Janusz Korczak, and Emanuel Ringelblum, of course, that we mentioned also. And all of a sudden, the testimony of Ringelblum, for example, is given to the public, especially to the young student and so on, an army and schools that arrive here, and by an actor. And it's okay. I mean, people know it's an actor. It's not really Emanuel Ringelblum. It's a younger actor but it gave us opportunity to give this testimony of Ringelblum, of his chronics, as you mentioned, a much live opportunity in our exhibition. So it's based on our archive, but it's connected to the, as you can say, today to the public that come today to our museum. So that's talking about digital and archive.
Yeah, this is a problem, and I think that in few years probably we will change that, but we will see. So that was the last question I received. Maybe you would like to add something. I'm asking our panelists. If not, I would like to thank you again that you accept invitation, that you presented excellent lectures, and also thank you for discussion. And the best greetings from Warsaw.